Colorado Territory, 1870. The dying light painted the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains in hues of crimson and gold as Katherine O'Malley clutched the reins of her weathered wagon. Her knuckles had gone white, matching the pallor of her face. 3 small boys huddled in the back among their meager possessions, exhausted from the grueling journey that had consumed the last 2 months of their lives. The youngest, only 4, had fallen into a fitful sleep, his cherubic face streaked with dirt from the trail. "Not much farther, boys," Katherine said, her voice barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels. At 25, her face still held the softness of youth, though grief had etched fine lines around her eyes. Her honey-blonde hair, once her pride, hung limp beneath a faded bonnet, and her blue calico dress, though carefully mended, bore the stains of hard travel. The letter from her brother-in-law burned in her pocket like a brand. "No room for a widow and her brood," he'd written after her husband's death. "The mining camp is no place for a woman alone." 6 months a widow, and Patrick's family had cast them aside as swiftly as autumn discards leaves. Katherine believed with unwavering certainty that a woman with children and no husband was destined for charity and pity, nothing more. The frontier had taught her this cruel lesson repeatedly, in the whispers that followed her in town, in the rejection from her husband's family, in the hollow feeling that gnawed at her when she looked at her sons and wondered how she would feed them. What she wanted was simple: a roof over their heads, food on the table, and safety for her boys. What she needed, companionship, belonging, love, she had buried alongside Patrick O'Malley 6 months ago in that small Illinois cemetery. "Mama, I see smoke," 7-year-old Timothy pointed ahead, his voice lifting with excitement for the first time in days. Katherine squinted against the fading light. Indeed, thin wisps of smoke curled upward from what appeared to be a modest collection of buildings nestled in the valley below, Pine Creek, the tiny settlement where her cousin Martha had written they could find refuge, at least temporarily. "We made it, boys," Katherine whispered, more to herself than to her sons. She flicked the reins, urging the exhausted mules forward, just a little farther. The wagon hit a rut, jolting violently. The crack that followed sent ice through Katherine's veins. The left front wheel listed dangerously, and the wagon lurched to a sickening halt. "No," Katherine whispered, desperation clawing at her throat. "Not now. Please, not now." Timothy and 6-year-old Samuel scrambled to see what had happened, while 4-year-old Peter woke with a startled cry. Katherine climbed down, her skirts dragging in the dust as she assessed the damage. The wheel had split clean through, the aged wood finally surrendering to the punishing journey. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. Her boys were watching. "We'll have to," her voice broke. She had no idea what they would do, stranded as darkness fell, with the settlement still a good mile away. The sound of hoofbeats made her spin around, one hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver tucked in her wagon. The frontier had taught her caution above all. A rider appeared silhouetted against the sunset, moving toward them at an unhurried pace. As he drew closer, Katherine could make out a lean figure astride a chestnut gelding. Her heart hammered in her chest. Out here, strangers could mean salvation or danger with little middle ground. "Evening, ma'am," the rider called, still a dozen yards away. His voice carried easily on the still air, young, clear, with a slight drawl that suggested Texas origins. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." Katherine stood straighter, positioning herself between the approaching rider and her sons. "Just a broken wheel," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll manage." The rider drew closer, and Katherine could now see his face beneath the wide brim of his hat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25 at most, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A light stubble shadowed his strong jaw, and his face, though weathered by sun and wind, retained a youthfulness that belied the confidence in his bearing. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but that wheel's beyond repair," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I'm Bryce Ingram. I work at the Rocking T Ranch just outside Pine Creek." "Katherine O'Malley," she replied cautiously. "These are my sons Timothy, Samuel, and Peter." Bryce nodded to the boys with a genuine smile, before turning his attention back to Katherine. Mrs. O'Malley, night's falling fast and this isn't a good place to be stranded. The ranch is closer than town. I can take you and your boys there for the night, and we can send someone back for your belongings." Katherine hesitated. Everything she owned was in that wagon, everything she had left of Patrick and their life before. Yet the temperature was dropping rapidly, and her boys were hungry and exhausted. "Why would you help strangers?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Something flickered in Bryce Ingram's eyes, not offense but understanding. "Out here, ma'am, folks help folks. It's how we all survive." He glanced at the boys. "Besides, I reckon those young cowboys could use some hot food and a warm place to sleep tonight." Timothy and Samuel watched the stranger with undisguised fascination, while Peter clung to Katherine's skirts, thumb firmly in his mouth. Katherine weighed their options. They had none. "We accept your help with gratitude, Mr. Ingram," she said finally, "though I insist on paying for any trouble we cause." Bryce's expression remained neutral, but Katherine sensed his assessment. A widow with 3 young sons, clearly at the end of her resources, yet clinging to pride with tenacious dignity. "Let's get you all to the ranch before dark," was all he said. "We can sort out the rest tomorrow." The journey to the rocking tee took less than half an hour, with Peter perched in front of Bryce on his horse, and Katherine walking alongside with Timothy and Samuel. As they crested a gentle rise, the ranch spread before them. A sprawling main house constructed of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, a large barn and corrals containing horses that moved like shadows in the gathering dusk. "It's not fancy," Bryce said, "but it's solid and warm." To Katherine, who had spent weeks in a rattling wagon, sleeping under the stars or in squalid way stations, it looked like a palace. As they approached, a burly man with a silver-streaked beard emerged from the barn, squinting at their party with open curiosity. "Thomas," Bryce called, "we've got guests, Mrs. O'Malley and her sons had a wagon break down about a mile east of here." Thomas nodded, his weathered face inscrutable. "I'll tell Mrs. Harper to set extra places." His eyes lingered on Katherine and the boys for a moment before he turned back toward the house. "Thomas Hayward," Bryce explained. "Ranch foreman, man of few words but the best horseman in 3 territories." Katherine nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The reality of their situation, stranded, dependent on strangers, their future as uncertain as the darkening sky, pressed down upon her with crushing weight. The main house welcomed them with golden lamplight spilling from the windows. A woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Harper, the cook and housekeeper, fussed over the boys immediately, guiding them to wash up before settling them at a large wooden table laden with simple but hearty food. "Been a while since we had young ones around," she said, her plump face creasing in a smile as she watched the boys attack their meal with enthusiasm. "Does my heart good to hear children's voices again." Katherine picked at her own plate, exhaustion and tension robbing her of appetite. Across the table, Bryce Ingram ate steadily, occasionally glancing her way with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Mr. Thornton, he owns the ranch, is away on business in Denver," Bryce explained between mouthfuls. "But he'd want you to stay as long as needed. We've plenty of room." "You're very kind," Katherine said stiffly, "but we're expected in Pine Creek. My cousin Martha Wheeler, is waiting for us." Something shifted in Bryce's expression. "Martha Wheeler," he asked, "runs the boarding house on Main Street." Katherine nodded, relief washing over her. "You know her, then?" Bryce set down his fork slowly. "Mrs. O'Malley, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Martha Wheeler sold her boarding house 3 weeks ago. She left on the eastbound stage to St. Louis, said something about her sister being ill." The room seemed to tilt beneath Katherine's feet. That can't be right," she whispered. "She wrote to me. She said we could stay with her until I found work." "I'm mighty sorry," Bryce said, genuine regret in his voice. "Town's growing fast. Lots of changes happening." Katherine stared at her plate, struggling to maintain composure as her last hope crumbled. The boys, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding, chattered happily with Mrs. Harper, who was describing the ranch's horses with animated detail. "If you'll excuse me," Katherine managed, rising so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. "I need some air." She fled to the porch, gulping the crisp night air as if drowning. Stars blanketed the vast Colorado sky, cold and distant as the future that now stretched before her. The sound of the door opening behind her made her hastily wipe away tears. "Mrs. O'Malley," Bryce's voice was quiet. "I apologize for my behavior," Katherine said without turning. "It's been a long journey." "No need for apologies." He moved to stand beside her, respectfully distant. "I can't imagine what you've been through." The simple acknowledgement nearly broke her again. "What am I to do now?" she whispered, more to the night than to him. "Pine Creek's a growing town," Bryce said carefully. "There might be work or," he hesitated, "the rocking tea could use help, Mrs. Harper isn't as young as she once was, and there's the garden, the chickens. Mr. Thornton mentioned hiring additional help before he left." Katherine turned to him, moonlight illuminating the wariness in her eyes. "Mr. Ingram, I appreciate your kindness, but I've learned that offers to help a widow often come with expectations I'm not willing to meet." Bryce flinched as if she'd struck him. "Ma'am, that's not, I would never," he took a deep breath. "The Rocking Tea is a respectable place. Mr. Thornton's wife passed 5 years back. He runs things proper. I'm suggesting honest work for fair pay, nothing more." Shame colored Katherine's cheeks. "I've offended you, I'm sorry. The trail teaches harsh lessons about trust." "No offense taken," Bryce said, though his jaw remained tight. "But not all men are wolves, Mrs. O'Malley. Some of us were raised better than that." They stood in uncomfortable silence, the night sounds of the ranch, horses nickering softly, the distant howl of a coyote, filling the space between them. "Your boys are fine young men," Bryce finally said. "You've done well by them." The unexpected praise loosened something in Katherine's chest. "They're all I have left," she admitted. "Everything I do, every decision I make, is for them." "I understand that kind of responsibility," Bryce said quietly. "Been running this ranch since Mr. Thornton's son died 2 years back. Not the same as having children of your own, but I know what it means to carry others' welfare on your shoulders." Katherine studied him in the moonlight. There was something in his demeanor, a steadiness, a solidity, that reminded her of Patrick in the early days, before the coughing sickness had hollowed him out like a drought-stricken tree. "Stay a few days," Bryce suggested. "At least until we can get your wagon fixed. You can ride into town, see if there's work, no obligations." Katherine hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. "I can pay something for our keep," she insisted. "I have a little saved." "Keep your money," Bryce said firmly. "You'll need it. Consider it frontier hospitality." Before Katherine could protest further, the door opened and Mrs. Harper appeared, little Peter balanced on her ample hip. "This young cowboy is asking for his mama," she announced, "and the other two are about ready to drop where they sit." Peter reached for Katherine with a plaintive "mama" that melted the last of her resistance. Whatever her misgivings, her boys needed shelter and safety tonight. "Thank you," she said to Bryce, meaning it now. "We'll stay, just until the wagon's fixed." Bryce nodded, his expression warming. "You're home now," he said simply, then seemed to catch himself. "For as long as you need." Later, lying in an actual bed for the first time in months, with her sons sleeping peacefully around her, Katherine replayed those words in her mind. "You're home now." Such a simple phrase, yet it stirred something she'd thought long dead, a flicker of hope, a dangerous luxury for a widow with 3 sons and nowhere to go. She extinguished it firmly. The Rocking Tea was merely a temporary haven, nothing more. In the harsh light of morning she would face reality again, make plans, find a way forward that depended on no one but herself. Trust, Katherine had learned, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Rocking Tea Ranch, painting the outbuildings in soft gold and casting long shadows across the yard. Katherine woke to the unfamiliar sound of roosters crowing and the distant clatter of activity in the ranch kitchen. For a moment disorientation gripped her, the comfort of a real bed, the solid roof overhead, the absence of wagon canvas flapping in the wind, before memory rushed back. Her boys still slumbered, Timothy and Samuel sharing a narrow bed against the opposite wall, Peter curled like a comma beside her. She watched them breathe, these precious remnants of the life she'd once had, and steeled herself for the day ahead. By the time Katherine had roused the boys and made them presentable, the ranch was fully awake. The scent of coffee and frying bacon permeated the house, and male voices rumbled from the direction of the kitchen. She hesitated at the bedroom door, suddenly acutely aware of her worn dress and hastily pinned hair. In Illinois, as a blacksmith's wife, she had maintained certain standards. The journey west had stripped away such vanities, but now, faced with re-entering the world of ordinary social interaction, she felt their absence keenly. "Come on, Mama," Timothy urged, tugging at her hand. "I'm starving." Katherine straightened her shoulders. "Remember your manners," she reminded her sons, though the admonition was as much for her own benefit as theirs. The kitchen presented a tableau of frontier masculinity, 4 cowboys seated around the large table, devouring breakfast with single-minded focus, while Mrs. Harper bustled between stove and table, wielding a coffee pot like a conductor's baton. Bryce Ingram sat at the head of the table, a ledger open beside his plate, making notes between bites. The conversation halted abruptly as Katherine entered with her sons. 4 pairs of curious eyes assessed them, followed by awkward nods of greeting. "Good morning," Katherine said with as much dignity as she could muster. Bryce rose immediately, the other men following his lead with varying degrees of alacrity. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his voice carrying a note of command clearly meant for his men. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Katherine replied, guiding her wide-eyed sons to the empty chairs Mrs. Harper indicated. Bryce performed introductions with efficient courtesy. The ranch hands were Henry, Lucas, and Caleb, each progressively younger than the last, with Caleb barely out of boyhood himself. "The boys are already out with the horses," Mrs. Harper explained as she placed heaping plates before Katherine and her sons. "These layabouts are on fence duty today." The cowboys accepted the good-natured ribbing with grins, their initial discomfort at female presence easing as Katherine's sons peppered them with questions about ranch life. By the time breakfast concluded, Timothy had extracted promises of writing lessons, Samuel had learned 3 new words Katherine would need to address later, and Peter had somehow migrated to Lucas's knee, where he solemnly examined the young cowboy's pocket watch. "Mrs. O'Malley," Bryce said as the men prepared to depart for their day's work, "I sent Caleb to check your wagon at first light. He's brought back what could be carried easily. The rest will need the wagon to be fixed first." Katherine nodded gratefully. "I'd like to go into town today if possible," she said, "to inquire about work and see about my cousin's situation for myself." Something like disappointment flickered across Bryce's face, but he nodded. "Of course, I can take you in after I check the north pasture, around midday." "That would be," Katherine began, but Mrs. Harper interrupted. "Nonsense. The woman just got here after weeks on the trail. She needs a proper bath and rest, not more traveling." The housekeeper fixed Bryce with a stern look. "Town can wait a day. Besides, these young ones could use some settling time." Katherine opened her mouth to protest but caught the genuine concern in the older woman's eyes. The truth was, the prospect of another journey, even one as short as to the nearby town, filled her with exhaustion. "Perhaps Mrs. Harper is right," she conceded. "A day to recover would be welcome." Relief softened Bryce's expression. "Settled then, we'll go tomorrow." He donned his hat, nodded to Katherine, and departed with his men, leaving her alone with Mrs. Harper and the boys. "Now then," the housekeeper said briskly, "I've heated water for baths, boys first then you, and I've found some clothes that might serve until yours are properly laundered, belong to Mrs. Thornton, God rest her soul, but she wouldn't mind them being used by someone in need." Katherine's pride bristled at accepting charity, but practicality won out. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your kindness is unexpected." "Mrs. Harper's weathered face softened. "Life's hard enough out here without making it harder through foolish pride," she said, with the directness of one who has survived the frontier's harshest lessons. "Now let's get these young cowboys cleaned up." The day passed in a blur of domestic activity. Katherine bathed in luxury, actual hot water and lavender-scented soap, and donned a borrowed dress that, while slightly large, was whole and clean. Mrs. Harper proved to be a font of information, cheerfully sharing the ranch's history as they worked. Mr. Thornton started with nothing but a claim and determination 20 years ago, she explained as Katherine helped her knead bread dough. Built it up slow and steady. His wife, Elizabeth, was a Boston lady, too refined for some folks' tastes, but she had grit, died of fever 5 years back. Their son James took over running things, but he was killed in a fall 2 years ago. Horse spooked crossing a stream during spring flooding. How terrible, Katherine murmured, thinking of her own loss. Broke Mr. Thornton something fierce, Mrs. Harper continued. Spends more time in Denver now than here. Ranch would have fallen apart if not for Bryce. Boy's got ranching in his blood. Katherine's hands stilled in the dough. How long has Mr. Ingram worked here? Going on 8 years now. Showed up as a skinny 17-year-old looking for work. Mr. Thornton took to him right away. James and Bryce were like brothers. Mrs. Harper shook her head. After James died, Bryce stepped up. Runs this place better than most men twice his age could. Katherine absorbed this information silently. The portrait emerging of Bryce Ingram didn't match her initial wariness. A man who had essentially been adopted into a family, who had stepped up to preserve their legacy after tragedy. It spoke to character she hadn't expected to find on the frontier. The boys spent their day in a state of wonder, exploring the ranch under Mrs. Harper's watchful eye. By mid-afternoon, all three had visited the chickens, peered cautiously at the massive draft horses in the barn, and collected a fascinating array of rocks, feathers, and mysterious objects Katherine preferred not to examine too closely. When Bryce and his men returned at dusk, the transformation in Katherine's sons was remarkable. Timothy's face was flushed with excitement. Samuel couldn't stop talking about the chickens, and even Peter, usually so solemn, bubbled with enthusiasm. "Mr. Bryce says I can help with the horses tomorrow," Timothy announced over dinner. Katherine glanced at Bryce, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Just holding the lead rope while I check hooves," he clarified. "Nothing dangerous." "That's very kind," Katherine said carefully, "but we'll be going to town tomorrow." Disappointment clouded Timothy's face. "But Mama." "We need to find our own place," Katherine reminded him gently. "Our own home." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Bryce focused intently on his plate, while Mrs. Harper exchanged glances with Thomas, the taciturn foreman. "About that," Thomas said, speaking directly to Katherine for the first time. "Wagon wheels worse than we thought, split clean through the hub. Blacksmith in town will need to forge a new one." "How long will that take?" Katherine asked, dread coiling in her stomach. Thomas shrugged. "Week, maybe more. Smith's busy with mining equipment repairs. Your wagon ain't his priority." A week, the prospect of imposing for that long made Katherine's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Perhaps there's a room to let in town," she suggested. "We could stay there while waiting for repairs." "Town's full up," Thomas countered. "Mining strike up north has every bed occupied." "You're welcome here," Bryce said quietly. "As I said, there's work if you want it." The ranch could use a woman's touch, and the boys seem happy enough. Katherine met his gaze across the table, searching for hidden meanings or expectations, but found only straightforward sincerity. "I can't accept charity for a week," she said firmly. "Then it's not charity," Bryce replied. "It's employment, room and board plus wages. Mrs. Harper could use the help, and there are dozens of tasks around the ranch that need attention." Katherine glanced at Mrs. Harper, who nodded vigorously. "Been saying for years we need more hands in the house. Ranch this size should have at least 2 women running the domestic side." The offer tempted Katherine more than she cared to admit. The prospect of stability, even temporary, was seductive after months of uncertainty, yet caution held her back. May I think about it?" Bryce nodded, something like understanding in his eyes. "Of course. The offer stands whenever you decide." Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Katherine slipped outside again, drawn to the porch by restlessness and the need to think clearly. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage, and stars crowded the sky in numbers she'd never seen in Illinois. The soft creak of the door announced she wasn't alone. Bryce emerged, carrying 2 cups of steaming liquid. "Coffee," he offered, extending one to her, "or there's tea if you prefer." "Coffee is fine, thank you." Katherine accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. "It's beautiful here," she said after a moment. "Wilder than home, but beautiful in its own way." Bryce leaned against the porch railing. "Where was home before?" "A small town outside Chicago," Katherine replied. "My husband Patrick was the blacksmith there. We had a good life." Her voice caught slightly, "until the consumption took him." Bryce said nothing, simply giving her space to continue if she wished. "His brother owns a silver mine near Boulder," Katherine went on. "When Patrick died, I wrote to him, asking for work, a place to stay, anything to help us get established. He wrote back that there was no place for a widow with children in a mining camp." The bitterness she'd tried to suppress colored her words. "Yet when I wrote to Martha, my cousin, she said the West was full of opportunities for those willing to work hard. Said Pine Creek needed good people." "She wasn't wrong about that," Bryce said quietly. "Pine Creek's growing fast, might be good opportunities there for you." Katherine sipped her coffee, letting the warmth and bitterness ground her. "Why are you helping us, Mr. Ingram, truly?" Bryce was silent so long Katherine thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice held a distance, as if he spoke from the depths of memory. "I was 14 when my family tried to make the crossing to Oregon," he said. "Wagon train of 30 families. Cholera hit us in Nebraska territory. Took my mother and sisters in 3 days. Father lasted longer, but by Wyoming he was gone too." He stared out into the darkness. "Finished the journey with the Millers. They had no obligation to a half-grown boy, but they shared what little they had. Never forgot that kindness." Katherine absorbed this, seeing him anew, not just the capable ranch foreman, but a boy who had known loss as profound as her own son's. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "About your family." Bryce nodded acknowledgement. "Point is, Mrs. O'Malley, out here, folks survive by helping each other. No charity in it, just the understanding that next time it might be me needing help." Katherine considered this perspective, so different from the ruthless self-sufficiency she'd assumed the frontier demanded. "I'll take you to town tomorrow as promised," Bryce continued. "You can see for yourself what options Pine Creek offers, but whatever you decide, you and your boys are welcome here as long as needed." The simple assurance, offered without conditions or expectations, touched something deep in Katherine. A wound beginning to heal, perhaps, or a seed of trust cautiously taking root. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Bryce tipped his hat slightly. "Rest well, Mrs. O'Malley." As he turned to leave, Katherine found herself asking, "How did you end up at the rocking tea?" He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Luck, wandered in half-starved looking for work. Mr. Thornton took one look at me and said I reminded him of himself as a young man, gave me a chance when no one else would." He shook his head, the memory clearly still powerful. "Man saved my life without knowing it. Taught me everything I know about ranching, about being a man worth something." The naked gratitude in his voice resonated with Katherine. Here was someone who understood the precarious nature of fortune, the way life could be upended in an instant, and the profound impact of unexpected kindness. "Your Mr. Thornton sounds like a good man," she observed. "The best," Bryce agreed. "You'll meet him when he returns from Denver. I think you'd like him." The presumption that she would still be here when the ranch owner returned made Katherine's guard rise again instinctively. Yet she found she couldn't summon the energy for proper indignation. Instead, she merely nodded and bid Bryce good night. Sleep came more easily that night, despite the uncertainty that still shadowed her future. For the first time since Patrick's death, Katherine felt something like safety, temporary though it might be. Pine Creek proved to be a revelation. As Bryce drove the wagon into town the following morning, Katherine couldn't hide her surprise at the bustling settlement. A main street lined with substantial buildings, A general store, hotel, several saloons, a bank and various shops bustled with activity. Mining equipment rattled past on heavy wagons, women in relatively fashionable dress navigated the wooden sidewalks, and everywhere was the sense of a place in the midst of becoming something greater than it was. "It's grown considerably since I came through 6 months ago," Katherine admitted as they pulled up before the general store. "Silver strike in the mountains," Bryce explained. "Brought in miners and the miners brought business. Town's doubled in size this year alone." The general store owner confirmed Martha's departure, left for St. Louis on the 15th. Said her sister was ailing, and Katherine's heart sank. She had pinned so much hope on her cousin's promise of shelter and assistance. Their tour of the town revealed both opportunity and challenge. Pine Creek needed workers of all kinds. The hotel sought a laundress, the general store a clerk, the new schoolhouse a teacher, but each position came with complications. The laundry work was backbreaking for minimal pay. The store owner clearly expected more than clerical skills from a widow. The teaching position required credentials Katherine didn't possess. Most dishearteningly, housing was indeed scarce. The hotel was full, the boarding house had a waiting list, and the few rental cabins commanded prices beyond Katherine's means. "Times like these, prices soar," Bryce commented as they left the real estate office. "Boom towns aren't kind to those without resources." Katherine's spirit flagged with each closed door. By midday, the optimism with which she had begun their expedition had evaporated entirely. "Perhaps we should return to the ranch," she conceded as they stood outside the blacksmith's shop, where the news about her wagon wheel had been as Thomas predicted, a week's wait at minimum. "One more stop," Bryce suggested. "The newspaper office. Editor's wife runs the town's only library. She might know of opportunities we haven't heard about." The newspaper office occupied the front half of a neat clapboard building, with the library, really just a large room lined with bookshelves, taking up the rear. Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, a brisk woman with spectacles and an air of efficient intelligence, greeted them warmly. "Mrs. O'Malley is looking for work and lodging," Bryce explained after introductions. "She has 3 young boys, and her wagon needs repairs." Mrs. Prescott's shrewd gaze assessed Katherine. "Teaching experience?" "Some," Katherine admitted. "I taught reading to the children in our church back home. Homeschool board is desperate. Regular teacher left when the miners came, said the town was becoming too rough." Mrs. Prescott tapped her fingers thoughtfully. "They might overlook formal credentials given the circumstances." Hope flickered in Katherine's chest. "I would be very interested." "As for housing," Mrs. Prescott frowned, "that's more difficult, town's bursting at the seams." The hope dimmed as quickly as it had ignited. "What about the old Reynolds place?" Bryce suggested. "Still vacant last I heard." Mrs. Prescott's expression brightened. "Yes, the Reynolds cabin, out past the creek about a mile from town. Been empty since old man Reynolds passed last winter. Needs work, but it's solid enough." "Who owns it now?" Katherine asked cautiously. "The bank, I believe. They've had trouble selling it due to the location, too far for miners' convenience but too close to town for ranching." Mrs. Prescott adjusted her spectacles. "I could speak to Mr. Hollister at the bank. He and my husband play checkers on Wednesdays." For the first time that day, Katherine allowed herself to feel genuine optimism. "That would be most appreciated." As they left the newspaper office, the weight that had pressed on Katherine's shoulders all morning seemed to lighten slightly. "That's the first real possibility we've found," she admitted. Bryce nodded, though something in his expression had grown reserved. "The Reynolds place is basic. 1 room, root cellar, hand pump for water. Been empty for months, so there'll be work needed." "I'm not afraid of work," Katherine said, lifting her chin. "And it would be ours, mine and the boys." "Of course," Bryce agreed, though his tone remained neutral. "Shall we check with the bank before heading back?" The bank manager, Mr. Hollister, confirmed the cabin's availability and, after consulting his ledger, named a price that made Katherine's heart sink. Even with her modest savings, it was beyond reach. "I could pay half now and the remainder in installments," she suggested, desperation edging into her voice. Mr. Hollister's expression remained sympathetic but firm. Bank policy requires full payment for property sales, Mrs. O'Malley. However, we could discuss a rental arrangement, with option to purchase later. The terms he outlined were barely manageable on a teacher's salary, assuming she secured the position. Katherine would need to deplete her savings for the initial payment, leaving nothing for emergencies or improvements to the cabin itself. Outside the bank, Katherine tried to maintain composure despite the crushing weight of reality. "It seems I have decisions to make," she said, striving for a practical tone. Bryce studied her face. "Mrs. O'Malley, Katherine," he said, using her given name for the first time, "my offer of work at the ranch stands. You and your boys would have a home, income, and time to make your plans without desperation forcing your hand." The use of her first name, the genuine concern in his voice, the uncomplicated kindness of his offer, all combined to bring unexpected tears to Katherine's eyes. She turned away, fighting for control. "You hardly know us," she whispered. "I know enough," Bryce replied simply. "You're a woman of courage and dignity doing your best for your sons. That deserves respect and assistance, not exploitation." Katherine wiped discreetly at her eyes. "You must think me foolish, weeping over simple kindness." "Never foolish," Bryce said firmly. "Just human." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, the decisions before Katherine no less daunting, but somehow less solitary than before. The physical presence of Bryce beside her on the wagon seat, solid, steady, unpresumptuous, provided a curious comfort she hadn't experienced since Patrick's death. At the ranch, the boys greeted their return with exuberance, eager to share their day's adventures with Mrs. Harper, who had clearly indulged their every whim. Even Peter, usually so reserved with strangers, clung to the housekeeper's skirts with proprietary affection. "They were angels, Mrs. Harper declared with transparent dishonesty, as Samuel's dirt-streaked face and Timothy's torn sleeve told a different story. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Katherine sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, methodically calculating figures. The school position, if she secured it, would provide barely enough for basic necessities. The cabin rental would consume most of her savings initially. Repairs to both cabin and wagon would strain her resources further. The alternative, accepting Bryce's offer of employment at the ranch, presented its own complications. It meant remaining under obligation, delaying independence, and Katherine set down her pencil, facing the truth she'd been avoiding. It meant continued proximity to Bryce Ingram, a man whose presence affected her in ways both comforting and unsettling. The warmth in his blue eyes when he spoke to her sons, the quiet competence with which he managed the ranch, the respectful distance he maintained despite his obvious interest, all stirred feelings Katherine had believed buried with Patrick. "Foolishness," she muttered to herself, "schoolgirl nonsense." "Mrs. O'Malley," Mrs. Harper's voice startled her. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, a steaming cup in her hand. "Thought you might like some tea before turning in." "Thank you," Katherine said, hastily gathering her calculations. Mrs. Harper set down the tea and, without invitation, settled her substantial frame into the chair opposite. "Made up your mind yet?" Katherine sighed. "Is it that obvious? When you get to my age, you learn to read faces." Mrs. Harper's eyes, sharp despite her years, held Katherine's. "May I speak plainly?" "Please do." "You're afraid of staying here because of Bryce." The direct assessment made Katherine flinch. "That's not." Mrs. Harper held up a weathered hand. "No need for pretense with me, child. I see how you look at him when you think no one's watching. And I see how you guard yourself immediately after." She sipped from her own cup. "You think accepting his help means accepting his interest." Katherine stared at the table, uncomfortable with such transparency. "My husband has been dead barely 6 months," she said quietly. "I have 3 sons who need stability and security, not complications." "Bryce Ingram is a good man," Mrs. Harper said simply. "Better than most. He respects boundaries and understands honor." She leaned forward slightly. "His offer of work is just that, work, nothing more unless you wish it. The plain-speaking both embarrassed Katherine and relieved her. "You're very direct, Mrs. Harper." "Life's too short for dainty words and misunderstandings," the older woman replied with a shrug, "especially out here." Katherine sipped her tea, considering, and what of Mr. Thornton? Would he approve of a widow and 3 boys taking up residence in his home? Mrs. Harper's laugh was unexpected. "Edward Thornton, he'd be delighted. Man's been trying to convince Bryce to settle down for years. Says the ranch needs the sound of children to make it whole again." "I'm not settling down with anyone," Katherine said sharply. "Of course not," Mrs. Harper agreed, though her eyes twinkled. "Just pointing out that Mr. Thornton would welcome your presence, not resent it." After Mrs. Harper retired, Katherine remained at the table, the decision before her no less complex but somehow clearer. The practical considerations, safety for her boys, financial security, time to plan their future without desperation, all pointed to accepting Bryce's offer. If her heart fluttered at the thought of daily interaction with the young rancher, well, that was her own weakness to master. Morning brought clarity and decision. Katherine approached Bryce as he returned from the early chores, her resolve firm. "Mr. Ingram," she began formally, "I've considered your offer of employment at the ranch." Bryce paused, giving her his full attention despite the demands of the day already pulling at him. "If the position is still available," Katherine continued, "I would like to accept, for a trial period of 1 month. After that, we can reassess the arrangement." Relief and pleasure transformed Bryce's face. "I'm glad to hear it, Mrs. O'Malley. The position is definitely still available." "I have conditions," Katherine added quickly. "I expect to be treated as an employee, not a charity case. I'll work hard and earn my keep and that of my sons." "Understood," Bryce said seriously, though his eyes held a warmth that made Katherine's resolve waver momentarily. "And I have one condition of my own." Katherine tensed. "Yes." "That you call me Bryce." A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth. "Mr. Ingram makes me feel like I'm in trouble with the schoolmaster." The simple request, delivered with such unaffected charm, melted Katherine's formality despite herself. "Very well, Bryce, and you may call me Katherine." "Katherine," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Welcome to the rocking tea." The next weeks unfolded in a pattern both industrious and healing. Katherine threw herself into work with the determination of one proving her worth. She assisted Mrs. Harper with cooking and cleaning, took over management of the henhouse and garden, mended endless piles of Cowboy's clothing, and gradually expanded her domain to include inventory of household supplies and coordination with merchants in town. The ranch hands, initially awkward around a young widow in their midst, soon accepted her presence with respectful camaraderie. Even taciturn Thomas unbent enough to compliment her stew one evening, high praise from a man who measured words as if they cost gold. The boys thrived in the ranch environment. Timothy, at 7, shadowed the Cowboys whenever permitted, soaking up knowledge of horses and cattle with sponge-like enthusiasm. Samuel discovered an affinity for woodworking under Thomas's gruff tutelage, producing increasingly recognizable carvings of ranch animals. Even little Peter blossomed, following Mrs. Harper around the kitchen and garden, his vocabulary expanding daily. And Bryce maintained a careful distance that Katherine found both admirable and, increasingly, frustrating. He was unfailingly kind, attentive to the boys, and respectful of Katherine's position, never crossing the boundary between employer and employee. Yet sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that stirred emotions she wasn't ready to acknowledge. 3 weeks after their arrival, Katherine sat on the porch steps in the gentle evening light, darning socks and watching her sons play an elaborate game of their own invention in the yard. The peaceful scene, her boys laughing, the ranch settling into evening routines, the mountains turning purple with approaching dusk, filled her with a contentment she had not expected to feel again. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Bryce approached on horseback, returning from a day checking fence lines in the north pasture. He dismounted with fluid grace, and Katherine found herself admiring the easy strength in his movements, the confidence in his bearing. "Evening, Catherine," he called, leading his horse toward the barn. "Boy's been behaving." "Mostly," she replied with a smile, though Samuel convinced Peter that worms make excellent pocket companions. Bryce laughed, the sound warming Catherine in ways she tried to ignore. "Sounds like a Central Ranch education to me." He disappeared into the barn, and Catherine returned to her darning, ignoring the slight acceleration of her heartbeat. This attraction, this awareness of Bryce as a man rather than merely an employer, was something she couldn't afford to indulge. Yet with each passing day, it grew harder to maintain the distance her circumstances demanded. Dinner that evening was a lively affair. Lucas, one of the younger hands, had spotted a mountain lion while riding the western boundary, and the tale grew more dramatic with each retelling, much to the boys' wide-eyed delight. "Biggest cat I ever saw," Lucas insisted, gesturing expansively. "Yellow eyes like lanterns and paws the size of dinner plates." "Sounds more like a grizzly than a mountain lion," Thomas remarked dryly, prompting laughter around the table. As the meal concluded, Bryce cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Got news today," he announced. "Mr. Thornton's coming home end of next week. Letter arrived with the supply wagon." A ripple of reaction passed through the gathered ranch hands, pleasure mixed with a certain wariness that Catherine found curious. "Been away longer than usual this time," Mrs. Harper observed, beginning to clear plates. Bryce nodded, a shadow crossing his features briefly. "Denver business took longer than expected, apparently." Something in his tone made Catherine glance up sharply, but his expression had already smoothed into its customary calm. Later, as they worked together washing dishes, a task Bryce had taken upon himself despite initial protests that it wasn't a foreman's job, Catherine ventured a question. "You seem concerned about Mr. Thornton's return," she observed carefully. "Is something wrong?" Bryce's hands stilled momentarily in the dishwater before resuming their task. "Not wrong, exactly, just complicated." When he didn't elaborate, Catherine let the subject drop. Whatever tensions existed between Bryce and his employer were not her concern. Yet a seed of unease had been planted, a reminder that their current arrangement was temporary and subject to the ranch owner's approval. That night Catherine dreamed of Patrick for the first time in months. Not the gaunt, hollow-eyed man of his final days, but the strong, laughing blacksmith she had married, showing Timothy how to pump the bellows, swinging Samuel onto his shoulders, cradling infant Peter in arms muscled from years at the anvil. In the dream, Patrick looked at her with eyes full of love and something else, permission, perhaps, or release. She woke with tears on her cheeks but a curious lightness in her heart, as if some burden had been set down without her noticing. The day before Edward Thornton's expected arrival, a thunderstorm descended on the rocking T with biblical fury. Rain lashed at windows, lightning split the sky with jagged brilliance, and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire. By mid-morning the creek had overflowed its banks, and by noon concern had grown to alarm. "South pastures flooding," Lucas reported, dripping on the kitchen floor as Mrs. Harper plied him with coffee. "Cattle are stranded on the high ground, but water's still rising." Bryce, who had been out since dawn, burst through the door at that moment, rain streaming from his slicker. "We need to move those cattle," he announced without preamble. "Creek's damming up with debris upstream. If it breaks, we'll lose half the herd." The urgency in his voice galvanized the men. Despite Catherine's protests, Timothy insisted on helping, his small face set with determination that reminded her painfully of Patrick. "I can lead the horses from the barn to the house," he argued. "Caleb showed me how. You need everyone, Mr. Bryce." Bryce looked to Catherine, clearly torn between necessity and respect for her authority. "It would help," he admitted. "But only if your mother agrees and only between barn and house. No further." Catherine wanted to refuse to keep her son safe inside, but the pride and purpose in Timothy's expression stopped her. "Very well," she conceded. "But you obey Mr. Bryce exactly, understand." The next hours passed in a blur of activity and anxiety. From the porch, Catherine watched the ranch hands battle wind and rain, moving cattle to higher ground as the creek continued to rise. Bryce was everywhere directing men, roping stranded calves, shoring up fences against the water's pressure. Timothy performed his assigned task with solemn responsibility, leading the remaining horses from barn to house paddock, his small figure dwarfed by the animals but steady in his purpose. When the sound came, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ranch, Katherine knew instantly what it meant. The debris dam had broken. "Timothy!" she screamed, scanning desperately for her son. Through the curtain of rain she saw him, halfway between barn and house, leading the last mare. And beyond him, a wall of water surging down the creek bed, breaking free of its banks, racing toward the ranch yard. Katherine was running before conscious thought formed, her skirts heavy with rain, her lungs burning. But she knew with terrible certainty that she couldn't reach him in time. Then Bryce was there, galloping toward Timothy from the pasture, his horse fighting the strengthening current. In one fluid motion, he leaned from the saddle, scooped Timothy up by his jacket, and swung the boy onto the horse in front of him. They turned toward the house just as the full force of the flash flood hit the yard, turning it into a churning lake. Katherine reached the porch steps as Bryce urged his exhausted horse the final yards through water already knee-deep. Timothy's face was white with shock, but he clung to the saddle horn with grim determination. "Inside, quick!" Bryce shouted above the storm's roar, lifting Timothy down into Katherine's waiting arms. For one terrible moment, Katherine thought Bryce would turn back, would rejoin his men in their desperate battle to save the herd. Instead, he dismounted and slapped his horse toward the barn, which stood on slightly higher ground. "The others?" Katherine asked as they stumbled inside. "Safe on the ridge," Bryce assured her, stripping off his dripping slicker. "We got the cattle moved in time, just property damage now." Relief made Katherine's knees weak. She clutched Timothy to her, feeling his small body tremble with cold and fading adrenaline. "You saved him," she said to Bryce, her voice catching. "If you hadn't been there." "But I was," Bryce interrupted gently. "And he's fine, showed real courage out there." Timothy, despite his ordeal, straightened at the praise. "I didn't drop the lead rope," he said proudly, "even when the water came." Something passed between the man and boy in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that brought fresh tears to Katherine's eyes. She had seen Patrick look at Timothy that same way, with that same mixture of pride and protective love. "Get him into dry clothes," Bryce said, his voice roughening. "I need to check the rest of the buildings." Before Katherine could protest, he was gone again, back into the storm that still raged outside. That night, with the boys finally asleep and the storm subsiding to occasional grumbles of distant thunder, Katherine found Bryce in the kitchen, slumped at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold before him. He looked utterly drained, the lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes and mouth. "You should rest," she said softly, taking the chair opposite. Bryce looked up, summoning a weary smile. "Just catching my breath before the final rounds." "Surely that can wait until morning." He shook his head. "Need to check the creek banks, make sure nothing else is at risk of giving way." Katherine studied him in the lamplight, the mud still caking his boots, the strain evident in the set of his shoulders, the haunted look that came from responsibility pushed to its limits. "Thank you," she said simply. "For Timothy, for everything." Bryce's expression softened. "He's a brave boy, you should be proud." "I am," Katherine agreed, "of all my sons." She hesitated, then added, "Patrick would have been grateful to you too." At the mention of her husband, something flickered in Bryce's eyes, a shadow quickly suppressed. "You don't talk about him much," he observed carefully. Katherine traced the grain of the wooden table with one finger. "It hurt too much at first, and then, I suppose I worried that speaking of him would somehow be disloyal to our new circumstances." She looked up, meeting Bryce's gaze directly. "But that's wrong, isn't it? My boys deserve to know their father, even in memory." "They do," Bryce agreed quietly, "and you deserve the comfort of those memories too." The understanding in his voice, free from jealousy or resentment, touched Katherine deeply. "Patrick was a good man," she said, the words coming easier than expected. "Strong, kind, devoted to his family. The boys are so like him in different ways. Timothy has his sense of responsibility, Samuel his creativity, Peter his gentleness. Bryce listened with genuine interest, asking questions that helped Katherine speak freely of the man she had loved and lost. It felt strangely healing to share Patrick with someone who had never known him, as if in the telling she was both honoring his memory and releasing some of the pain of his absence. "He would have wanted you to be happy," Bryce said finally. "To build a new life for yourself and the boys." The simple statement, offered without presumption or expectation, broke something open in Katherine's heart, a door long sealed, now cautiously opening to possibility. "I think," she said carefully, "that he would have liked you." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Bryce reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers, an invitation, not a demand. Katherine looked at his outstretched hand, weathered from work yet gentle in its offering. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her own hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his fingers close around hers. Not a commitment, not a promise, just a connection, human and honest. They sat that way for several heartbeats, hands joined across the scarred kitchen table, the silence between them comfortable and charged with unspoken possibility. Then the moment passed. Bryce squeezed her hand once gently before releasing it. "I should make those final checks," he said, rising. Katherine nodded, suddenly shy. "Be careful," she said simply. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I will. Sleep well, Katherine." After he left, Katherine remained at the table, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart beating a new rhythm, tentative but undeniable. For the first time since Patrick's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she had planned, a future that included Bryce Ingram and the Rocking T Ranch. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt strangely like coming home. Edward Thornton arrived the following afternoon, the storm's aftermath still evident in muddy yards and debris-strewn pastures. Katherine, busy in the kitchen with Mrs. Harper, heard the commotion of his arrival, the clatter of a wagon, men's voices calling greetings, the general stirring of the ranch into a higher state of alertness. "Best put on fresh coffee," Mrs. Harper said, wiping flour from her hands. "Mr. Thornton will want to hear everything about the flood damage." Katherine nodded, suddenly nervous. Despite assurances from both Bryce and Mrs. Harper that the ranch owner would welcome her presence, she couldn't help feeling like an interloper. What if he resented her occupation of his home? What if he questioned Bryce's judgment in hiring her? Before she could voice these concerns, the kitchen door swung open and Bryce entered, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man whose bearing commanded attention despite his travel-worn appearance. "Mr. Thornton, may I present Mrs. Katherine O'Malley," Bryce said formally. "Katherine, this is Edward Thornton, owner of the Rocking T." Katherine wiped her hands on her apron and extended one tentatively. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thornton." Edward Thornton was not what she had expected. Though clearly in his 50s, with silver threading his dark hair and beard, he possessed a vitality that belied his years. His face, weathered by sun and wind, crinkled into unexpected warmth as he took her hand. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his voice a rich baritone. "Bryce's letter mentioned you and your sons. I'm delighted you've joined our little family here." The genuine welcome in his tone eased Katherine's apprehension. "Thank you for your hospitality, sir. I hope our presence hasn't been an imposition." Thornton laughed, the sound filling the kitchen. "Imposition, from what Bryce tells me, you've revolutionized the place. Never seen the house so orderly, the men so well fed, or the garden so productive." Heat rose to Katherine's cheeks at the praise. "Mrs. Harper deserves most of the credit," she demurred. "Nonsense," the housekeeper interjected, setting a cup of coffee before her employer. "Girls being modest, she works from dawn to dusk and the boys are a blessing around the place." As if summoned by mention, Katherine's sons burst into the kitchen at that moment, halting abruptly at sight of the stranger. Timothy recovered first, stepping protectively in front of his younger brothers. "Boys," Katherine said, "this is Mr. Thornton who owns the ranch. Mr. Thornton, my sons Timothy, Samuel, and Peter." Thornton's expression softened as he regarded the children. Instead of the usual adult condescension, he addressed them directly and seriously. "I understand you've been helping around the ranch," he said to Timothy. "Bryce tells me you showed real courage during yesterday's flooding." Timothy straightened, pride evident in his small face. "Yes, sir. I led the horses to safety." "And you," Thornton continued, turning to Samuel, "have been learning woodcarving from Thomas." Samuel nodded shyly, producing from his pocket a small, crude but recognizable carving of a horse. "Made it myself," he said. "Fine workmanship," Thornton declared, examining the carving with apparent admiration. "Thomas doesn't share his craft with just anyone, you know." Finally he crouched to Peter's level, his large frame folding with surprising grace. "And you must be the young man who's been helping Mrs. Harper in the garden." Peter, usually so reticent with strangers, nodded solemnly. "I water the beans," he announced, his small chest puffing with importance. "Essential work," Thornton agreed gravely. "Ranch can't function without good beans." The easy way he spoke to her children, the respect he showed them, it confirmed everything Bryce and Mrs. Harper had said about the man's character. Katherine felt the last of her tension ebb away. "Now then," Thornton said, rising and addressing the adults again, "Bryce has been briefing me on the flood damage. Could have been much worse from the sound of it." "Good work, all of you." His gaze lingered on Bryce with unmistakable pride. "Especially you, son." Something complicated passed between the two men, affection, certainly, but also an undercurrent Katherine couldn't quite identify. "Just did what needed doing," Bryce said, his usual confidence muted in Thornton's presence. "As always," Thornton agreed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now I need to clean up after the journey. We'll discuss repairs over dinner." After Thornton departed, accompanied by Mrs. Harper's fussing about hot water and clean towels, Katherine turned to Bryce. "He's not what I expected," she admitted. "In what way?" Bryce asked, pouring himself coffee. Katherine considered, choosing her words carefully. "He's more approachable than I imagined, less the stern patriarch." Bryce smiled slightly. Edward Thornton wasn't born to wealth or position, built everything from nothing, so he never developed the arrogance that sometimes comes with inherited privilege. He sipped his coffee. "One of the many things I admire about him." The warmth in Bryce's voice when speaking of his employer confirmed what Katherine had already sensed, that their relationship went beyond the usual bounds of owner and foreman. "He treats you like a son," she observed. Something flickered across Bryce's face, pleasure tinged with constraint. "He's been good to me," he said simply. "Better than I deserved, probably." Before Katherine could pursue this curious statement, the boys reclaimed her attention, full of excitement about meeting the ranch's legendary owner and eager to return to their interrupted activities. Dinner that evening was a lively affair. Edward Thornton proved to be a gifted storyteller, regaling the table with tales of Denver society and the early days of the ranch that kept even the youngest cowboys engaged. He had a talent for including everyone in the conversation, drawing out shy Samuel with questions about his carvings, and making Peter giggle with exaggerated descriptions of fancy Denver ladies. After the meal, when the ranch hands had dispersed to their evening activities, and Mrs. Harper had shepherded the sleepy boys to bed, Thornton invited Katherine and Bryce to join him on the porch with glasses of good whiskey. "Finest bourbon from Kentucky," he explained, pouring a modest measure for Katherine despite her initial demurral. "Medicinal after the excitement of the flood." The night was clear and cool, the storm's violence replaced by tranquil starlight. Katherine sipped the unfamiliar liquor, feeling its warmth spread through her chest as she listened to the men discuss ranch business. Fences to be repaired, cattle to be moved to summer pastures, supplies to be ordered from Denver. The easy competence with which Bryce detailed the ranch's operations, and the attentive respect with which Thornton received his assessments, spoke volumes about the trust between them. Katherine found herself wondering again about their history, about how a 17-year-old orphan had come to earn such confidence from a man like Edward Thornton. As if reading her thoughts, Thornton turned the conversation in a more personal direction. "So, Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his deep voice gentle in the darkness, "Bryce tells me you were headed to Pine Creek when misfortune brought you to our door." Katherine nodded, her hands cradling the whiskey glass. "My cousin Martha owned the boarding house there. She had promised shelter while I found work, but she'd already left town," Thornton finished. "Yes, I heard about that from Prescott at the newspaper." "Unfortunate timing." "It turned out for the best," Katherine said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "The ranch has been healing for my sons and for me." Thornton studied her over the rim of his glass. "Loss takes time to mend," he observed quietly. "I lost my Elizabeth 5 years ago. Some days the absence still feels fresh as yesterday." The simple acknowledgement of shared grief created an unexpected bond. "Does it get easier?" Katherine asked, the question she had never dared pose to anyone else. Thornton considered, his gaze shifting to the distant mountains silvered by moonlight. "Not easier," he said finally. "Different. The pain transforms from a constant companion to an occasional visitor. You learn to live alongside the emptiness rather than being consumed by it." He smiled slightly. "And eventually, you discover there's still room for joy, for new beginnings." Bryce had remained silent during this exchange, but Katherine felt his attention like a tangible presence, concerned, supportive, careful not to intrude. "Bryce tells me you're considering the teaching position in Pine Creek," Thornton continued, shifting to lighter topics. Katherine glanced at Bryce, surprised he had mentioned her tentative plans. "I've inquired about it," she confirmed. "Though without proper credentials, I'm not certain they'll consider me." "School board's desperate," Thornton said with a dismissive wave. "Half the children are running wild since Miss Abernathy left. Besides, I happen to serve on that board, and my opinion carries some weight." The casual mention of his influence reminded Katherine that despite his approachable manner, Edward Thornton was a man of considerable power in the region. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your generosity further." Thornton laughed, the sound rolling into the night. "My dear Mrs. O'Malley, it's pure self-interest. The ranch needs an educated populace from which to draw future employees, and I'd prefer my foreman not be distracted by worry over your welfare should you take a position in town." The pointed reference to Bryce's concern made Katherine glance quickly in his direction. Even in the dim light she could see color rising in his face. "Mr. Thornton," Bryce began, a warning in his tone. "Oh, calm down, boy," Thornton said with obvious affection. "I'm not interfering. Just making observations." He turned back to Katherine. "Though since we're speaking plainly, I hope you'll consider continuing your work here at the ranch, regardless of the teaching position. The place hasn't run this smoothly in years." The direct invitation, coupled with Thornton's earlier comments about Bryce's interest in her welfare, left Katherine momentarily speechless. Bryce rose abruptly. "I should check the north paddock fence again," he said. "The repairs may not hold if the creek rises further." Thornton waved a dismissive hand. "Sit down, Bryce. The fence can wait until morning. We have a guest." Something in his tone, gentle but unyielding, made Bryce hesitate before slowly resuming his seat. Katherine sensed undercurrents between the two men that she couldn't fully comprehend, a history both binding and occasionally constraining. "Now then," Thornton continued smoothly, "tell me about your plans for the boy's education, Mrs. O'Malley. I understand Timothy is quite the scholar." The conversation flowed more easily after that, with Thornton proving genuinely interested in Katherine's background and aspirations. By the time she excused herself, pleading fatigue, Katherine found herself genuinely liking the ranch owner, despite the complexity she sensed in his relationship with Bryce. As she prepared for bed, Katherine reflected on the day's events. Edward Thornton's arrival had not brought the disruption she had feared. If anything, his presence seemed to stabilize the ranch, providing a foundation of authority and purpose that complemented Bryce's more direct leadership. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there were currents beneath the surface, expectations, perhaps, or unspoken agreements, that she didn't fully understand. Her thoughts returned to Thornton's oblique references to Bryce's interest in her welfare. Was he merely observing what was apparent or actively encouraging a connection between them? And more importantly, how did she feel about such encouragement? The answer to that last question was becoming increasingly clear, though Katherine hesitated to acknowledge it fully. Her feelings for Bryce had grown beyond gratitude or simple attraction. His steadiness, his gentle way with her sons, the respect he showed her as both a woman and a worker, all had combined to create something deeper, more substantial. But was she ready? Patrick had been gone only 7 months. The wound of his loss, while no longer raw, had barely begun to heal. And the practical considerations remained. She was a widow with 3 young sons, dependent on the charity, no matter how disguised as employment of others. Romantic entanglements were a luxury she could ill afford. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was Bryce's face that filled her thoughts, his blue eyes crinkling with laughter as he taught Timothy to rope, his strong hands gentle as he lifted Peter onto a pony's back, his quiet attentiveness as she spoke of Patrick. Perhaps, she thought as consciousness faded, perhaps there was room in her heart for new beginnings after all. The next morning brought a subtle shift in the ranch's rhythm. With Edward Thornton's return, decisions that had previously fallen to Bryce now required consultation. Katherine observed the dynamic with interest. The older man clearly valued Bryce's judgment, yet occasionally overruled him, particularly regarding expenditures for flood repairs. "The north pasture fence can wait," Thornton declared at breakfast. "South pasture's more critical with calving season approaching." Bryce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The North Creek bank is unstable. Another heavy rain, and we could lose that entire section to erosion." "We'll shore it up temporarily," Thornton decided. "Full repairs next month when cash flow improves." Katherine, busy serving breakfast to the ranch hands, caught the quick flash of frustration in Bryce's eyes before he nodded acceptance. It was the first crack she had observed in his usually unflappable demeanor. Later that morning, as Katherine gathered eggs in the henhouse, Thornton sought her out. He entered the small building with a ducked head, his imposing frame incongruous among the nesting boxes and scratching hens. "Mrs. O'Malley," he greeted her, "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Katherine straightened, smoothing her apron self-consciously. "Not at all, Mr. Thornton. Is there something you need?" Thornton smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Just a moment of your time. I've been speaking with Mrs. Harper about household accounts and your contribution to the ranch's operation." Katherine tensed, suddenly fearful that despite his welcoming manner, Thornton might consider her position unnecessary. "She speaks very highly of you," Thornton continued. "Says you've organized the household more efficiently than it's run in years, and I've observed for myself how your presence has improved morale among the men. Nothing like good food and clean clothes to keep Cowboys content." "Mrs. Harper exaggerates my contributions," Katherine demurred, though pleasure at the praise warmed her cheeks. "I doubt that very much," Thornton said firmly. "In any case, I'd like to formalize your position here. Full salary, with room and board for you and your boys included. The arrangement would be permanent, with quarterly reviews of your responsibilities and compensation." The offer took Katherine completely by surprise. "Mr. Thornton, that's extremely generous, but—" "Not generosity, Mrs. O'Malley, sound business. The ranch runs better with you here, it's as simple as that." Katherine set down her basket of eggs, needing a moment to absorb the implication of Thornton's offer. Permanent position, security for her boys, a home at the Rocking T for the foreseeable future, and Bryce, daily proximity to a man who increasingly occupied her thoughts. "May I think about it?" she asked finally. "It's a significant decision for my family." Thornton nodded, unsurprised by her caution. "Of course, take all the time you need." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Mrs. O'Malley. Bryce doesn't know I'm making this offer. I'd prefer to discuss it with him after you've made your decision." The request struck Katherine as odd. "You think he might object?" Something complicated passed across Thornton's face, affection mixed with exasperation. Quite the opposite, I suspect, but Bryce is, proud, might see my involvement as interference in his domain. He smiled slightly. Young men can be territorial, especially when matters of the heart are involved. Before Katherine could formulate a response to this startlingly direct observation, Thornton had ducked out of the henhouse, leaving her alone with her thoughts and a basket of half-gathered eggs. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, though Katherine's mind remained preoccupied with Thornton's offer and its implications. She observed Bryce with new awareness, noting the subtle tension that occasionally surfaced in his interactions with his employer, a guardedness that contrasted with his usual straightforward manner. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Katherine found herself restless and drawn to the porch, where the night air carried the scent of pine and the first hint of autumn crispness. She wasn't entirely surprised to find Bryce already there, leaning against a support post, gazing toward the mountains that rose black against the star-strewn sky. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "Too much on my mind," Katherine admitted, moving to stand beside him. They remained silent for several moments, the night sounds of the ranch, distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the rhythmic creaking of the windmill, creating a peaceful backdrop for their unspoken thoughts. "Mr. Thornton offered me a permanent position today," Katherine said finally. "Full salary, benefits for the boys." Bryce turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. He did, something flickered in his eyes, pleasure mingled with an emotion Katherine couldn't quite identify. That's good news, isn't it?" "I think so," Katherine said carefully. "Though he asked me not to tell you until I'd made my decision." Bryce's brow furrowed. Why would he broke off, understanding dawning. "He's interfering again." "Is that so terrible?" Katherine asked quietly. Bryce ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "It's not that, it's just," he sighed. "Edward Thornton is a good man, the best I've known, but he has strong ideas about how things should be. How people should be. Including you." "Especially me." Bryce's gaze returned to the distant mountains. "He took me in when I had nothing, taught me everything I know about ranching, about being a man worth something. I owe him everything." He paused, his profile sharp against the night sky. "But sometimes I wonder if I've become what he wants rather than what I might have been." The raw honesty of the admission touched Katherine deeply. "And what might you have been?" she asked softly. Bryce smiled, a fleeting expression in the darkness. "Who knows, a drifter maybe, a town marshal, a farmer," he shrugged. "Doesn't matter now, the rocking tea is my life. Has been since I was 17. "You sound almost resentful," Katherine observed carefully. "Not resentful," Bryce corrected quickly. "Grateful always, just, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to make decisions entirely my own." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Like offering you a position without consulting him first." The admission hung between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. "He thinks highly of you," Katherine said after a moment. "That much is obvious." "He's been like a father to me," Bryce acknowledged, "especially after James died." "His son?" Bryce nodded, pain briefly shadowing his features. "James Thornton was the brother I never had. 2 years older, but we were inseparable from the day I arrived. His death nearly destroyed his father. Would have, I think, if the ranch hadn't needed him." "And you," Katherine added softly, "the ranch needed you too." Bryce's smile held a touch of sadness. "I stepped up because there was no one else. Edward was lost for a while. By the time he found himself again, I'd taken over most of the operational decisions." "Which is why you sometimes chafe when he overrules you," Katherine concluded, pieces falling into place. "I sound ungrateful," Bryce said, regret coloring his tone. "I'm not. Edward Thornton saved my life, gave me purpose, a home, a future. Whatever I am, whatever I have, I owe to him." Katherine considered this, understanding now the complex interplay she had observed between the two men. "Gratitude and independence aren't mutually exclusive," she said carefully. "You can honor what he's given you while still charting your own course." Bryce looked at her with something like wonder. You understand, he said simply. I've had my own struggles with accepting help while maintaining dignity, Katherine reminded him with a small smile. It's not so different. The parallel struck Bryce visibly. No, I suppose it isn't. He shifted slightly, turning to face her fully. Katherine, about Mr. Thornton's offer. I haven't decided yet, she interrupted gently, though I'm leaning toward acceptance. Relief softened Bryce's features. I'm glad, he said quietly. The ranch is better with you here. The boys are thriving, and he hesitated, vulnerability replacing his usual confidence. And I've grown accustomed to your company. The simple admission, offered with such honest restraint, touched Katherine more deeply than florid declarations might have. In that moment, with the vast Colorado night surrounding them and the solid presence of the ranch beneath their feet, the last of her resistance crumbled. I've grown accustomed to yours as well, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Bryce moved closer slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. When she remained still, he reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with exquisite gentleness. Katherine, he said, her name a question and a plea. She knew what he was asking, permission, confirmation that she was ready, that this step wasn't premature or unwelcome. In answer, she leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes holding his in the moonlight. The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a gentle press of lips, a sharing of breath, a question still being asked and answered. Then Katherine's hand found Bryce's shoulder and his arm slipped around her waist, and the kiss deepened into something more certain, more hungry, yet still achingly tender. When they finally parted, Bryce rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. I've wanted to do that since the day you arrived, he admitted. Even covered in trail dust with 3 rowdy boys in tow, Katherine asked, a smile curving her lips. Especially then, Bryce affirmed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You were so fierce, so determined to protect them. It was magnificent. The description, so at odds with how Katherine had perceived herself in that moment of vulnerability, made her laugh softly. I was terrified, she confessed. Alone, wagon broken, nowhere to go. Not anymore, Bryce said, his voice deepening with emotion. You're home now, Katherine, you and your boys. If you want to be. The echo of his words from that first night, you're home now, struck Katherine with their fuller meaning. Not just shelter, not just employment, but belonging, home in the deepest sense. I think, she said carefully, that I would like that very much. Bryce's smile, radiant, relieved, full of promise, was answer enough. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his arms encircling her fully, drawing her against the solid warmth of his chest. When they finally separated, a new understanding existed between them, unspoken but profound. Katherine knew there would be challenges ahead, her grief still fresh, his complex relationship with Thornton, the practicalities of blending their lives. But in that moment, under the vast canopy of stars, the future seemed full of possibility rather than uncertainty. I should go in, she said reluctantly. The boys wake early. Bryce nodded, though his hands lingered at her waist. We have time, he said simply, all the time we need. The quiet confidence in his voice, not presumptuous but steady in its certainty, wrapped around Katherine like a blanket against the cool night air. For the first time since Patrick's death, she felt not just resignation to fate but active hope for what lay ahead. Good night, Bryce, she whispered, brushing one last kiss against his lips before withdrawing toward the door. Good night, Katherine, he replied, his voice following her like a caress. Sweet dreams. And for the first time in many months, Katherine slept deeply and without shadows, her dreams filled not with loss but with promise. The transformation in Katherine's relationship with Bryce, though profound to her, manifested in subtle ways over the following days. A lingering glance across the breakfast table, his hand at the small of her back as they crossed the yard. Quiet conversations on the porch after the boys were asleep. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that would cause gossip among the ranch hands or confusion for her sons, but enough that Mrs. Harper regarded them with knowing eyes and poorly concealed satisfaction. Edward Thornton, too, seemed to sense the shift, though he made no direct comment. His approving glances when Bryce and Katherine worked together, his deliberate inclusion of her in discussions about the ranch's future, all suggested his wholehearted support of their developing relationship. A week after Thornton's return, Katherine received a letter from Pine Creek School Board, offering her the teaching position contingent on an interview and demonstration lesson. The opportunity once so desperately sought now presented a decision more complex than she had anticipated. That evening, she found Bryce in the barn, meticulously cleaning tack by lamplight. The familiar scents of leather, hay, and horses created an atmosphere of peaceful industry that Katherine had come to associate with the ranch. "There you are," she said, approaching as he looked up with a smile that still had the power to quicken her pulse. "I received a letter from Pine Creek today." Bryce's hands stilled on the bridle he was oiling, the teaching position. Katherine nodded, perching on a hay bale beside his workbench. "They've asked me to come for an interview next week. If all goes well, I could start with the fall term." Complex emotions crossed Bryce's face, happiness for her opportunity mingled with concern about what it might mean for them. "That's wonderful news," he said carefully. "You'd make an excellent teacher." "Thank you," Katherine replied, warmed by his confidence. "But it complicates matters, doesn't it? If I accept, I'd need to move to town. The position includes a small cottage behind the schoolhouse." Bryce set aside the bridle, giving her his full attention. "Is that what you want?" he asked directly, "to move to town?" Katherine considered the question seriously. A month ago the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Independence, self-sufficiency, a fresh start for her family, these had been her driving goals, but now, "I'm not sure," she admitted. "So much has changed since we arrived here. The boys are happy, they're thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined, and she hesitated, still cautious about expressing feelings so recently acknowledged. "I've found unexpected happiness here as well." Bryce's expression softened. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Katherine," he began, his voice deepening with emotion, "I don't want to influence your decision. Your independence, your ability to provide for your boys, I respect that more than I can say. But I hope you know what you've come to mean to me, to all of us here." The simple sincerity of his words touched Katherine deeply. "I do," she said softly, "and that's what makes this decision so difficult." Bryce nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would it help to know that whatever you decide, nothing changes between us? If you take the teaching position, Pine Creek is just an hour's ride. I'd visit as often as you permitted." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "And if you stay, well, we'd have time to see where this leads. No pressure, no expectations beyond what you're comfortable with." The offer, so respectful of her autonomy, so unlike the possessiveness she had feared, confirmed what Katherine already knew. Bryce Ingram was a rare man, one whose strength included the capacity to support without dominating. "I need to think," she said finally, "to be sure I'm making this decision for the right reasons, not just—" She gestured vaguely between them, unwilling to define the growing attachment that both thrilled and frightened her. "Of course," Bryce agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need. The interview isn't until next week." He hesitated, then added with careful neutrality, "Have you discussed this with Mr. Thornton?" "About his offer of permanent employment here?" Katherine shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to sort through my own thoughts first." "Wise," Bryce said with a slight smile. "Edward can be persuasive when he has his mind set on something." The comment reminded Katherine of the undercurrents she had observed between the two men. "He cares deeply for you," she observed, "like a son." Bryce's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes," he agreed. "Though sometimes I wonder if he sees me, or the shadow of James when he looks at me." The vulnerability in the admission, so at odds with Bryce's usual confidence, moved Katherine to reach out, her palm gentle against his cheek. "He sees you," she said with quiet certainty. "A man of honor, capable and kind, as do I." Bryce turned his face to press a kiss into her palm, the gesture both reverent and intimate. "Whatever you decide, Katherine, know that he stopped, perhaps sensing that certain declarations, once made, would influence her decision in ways neither of them wanted. Know that your happiness matters to me, he finished instead. Yours and your boys. The restraint, the careful respect for her independence, confirmed what Katherine already knew in her heart. Bryce Ingram was a man worth building a future with when the time was right. Thank you, she said simply, rising from the hay bale. I'll let you know what I decide. As Katherine left the barn, her thoughts were more tangled than before. The teaching position represented the independence she had sought since Patrick's death, financial security of her own making, a home for her sons that depended on no one's charity or goodwill. Yet the rocking tea had become more than temporary shelter. It had become, in ways both subtle and profound, the home her heart recognized. And Bryce had become essential in ways Katherine had not believed possible 7 months into widowhood. His steady presence, his gentle way with her sons, the respect with which he treated her, all combined into something precious and unexpected. The thought of leaving him, of limiting their growing relationship to occasional visits, created an ache she could no longer ignore. That night, after checking on her sleeping sons, Timothy sprawled across his bed like a starfish, Samuel curled tightly around his wooden horse carving, Peter with thumb firmly in mouth. Katherine sat at the small desk in their room and wrote 2 letters. The first, to the school board, expressed gratitude for their consideration and requested a postponement of her interview until winter. She explained that current obligations prevented her from accepting a teaching position for the fall term, but she remained interested in future opportunities. The second letter was to Edward Thornton, formally accepting his offer of permanent employment at the Rocking Tea Ranch, with the condition that her hours allow for tutoring her sons and any other ranch children who might benefit from education. As she sealed the envelopes, Katherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The decision, once made, felt right, not just for herself, but for her family. The boys would have stability, security, and the benefit of growing up in an environment where men of honor like Bryce and Edward showed them daily what it meant to live with integrity and purpose. And she would have time to heal more fully from Patrick's loss, time to explore her growing feelings for Bryce without the pressure of imminent separation, time to build a foundation for whatever future might unfold between them. Morning brought a rare opportunity to deliver her decision to Edward Thornton privately. She found him on the porch, enjoying coffee and the sunrise before the ranch fully awakened. Mrs. O'Malley, he greeted her, rising with the courtly manners that occasionally surprised her, given his frontier background. You're up early. I have something for you, Katherine said, extending the envelope. My response to your generous offer. Thornton took the letter, his expression revealing nothing as he opened and read its contents. When he looked up, however, the pleasure in his eyes was unmistakable. I'm delighted, he said simply. The ranch will benefit greatly from your continued presence. Thank you for the opportunity, Katherine replied, and for your discretion regarding Bryce. A knowing smile touched Thornton's weathered face. Ah, so that's progressing, is it? Good. The boy deserves happiness, and you, if you'll forgive an old man's presumption, seem to bring out the best in him. Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks at the direct assessment. It's early days, she said carefully. We're both aware of the complexities. Thornton nodded, his expression sobering. Grief takes its own time, he acknowledged, as does learning to love again. But when the heart is ready, he gestured expansively toward the ranch spread before them, golden in the early light. This is a good place for new beginnings, Mrs. O'Malley. Has been for many of us. The simple wisdom, offered without judgment or expectation, confirmed Katherine's decision. Yes, she agreed softly, I believe it is. The next weeks unfolded in a rhythm both familiar and new. Katherine's position at the ranch formalized, her responsibilities expanding to include not just household management, but also rudimentary education for her sons and the younger ranch hands who expressed interest in improving their reading and arithmetic. 3 evenings a week, the kitchen table transformed into a classroom, with Timothy proudly assisting his mother in teaching Samuel and Peter alongside young Caleb, and occasionally other cowboys who drifted in with varying degrees of embarrassment about their limited schooling. Bryce, upon learning of Catherine's decision to remain at the ranch, had revealed his joy with characteristic restraint, a lingering embrace when they found themselves momentarily alone, a whispered thank you that contained volumes of meaning. Their relationship developed slowly, respectfully, with an awareness of the boys' adjustment and the ranch community's observation. Small traditions emerged: Sunday afternoon rides with the boys, Bryce teaching them horsemanship with patient detail. Evenings on the porch, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in comfortable silence. Stolen moments of privacy that grew gradually more intimate yet remained within the bounds of propriety. October painted the landscape in gold and crimson, the aspens in the high country transforming overnight into shimmering curtains of amber. Harvest brought increased activity, vegetables from the garden preserved for winter, the last hay cut and stored, cattle brought down from summer pastures before snow closed the high country. One crisp afternoon, Bryce proposed an expedition, a picnic in a sheltered valley where a small lake reflected the autumn splendor of surrounding peaks. "The boys will love it," he promised. "And we deserve a day of rest before winter preparations begin in earnest." The outing proved magical. Timothy and Samuel spent hours throwing stones across the lake's surface under Bryce's tutelage, competing to see who could achieve the most skips. Peter, still too small for such feats, contented himself with collecting treasures: colored leaves, unusual pebbles, a feather dropped by a passing hawk, which he presented to Catherine with solemn ceremony. As the boys played at the lake's edge, closely supervised by Bryce, Catherine spread their picnic on a blanket in a sunny clearing: fried chicken, biscuits, apple tarts, and a jug of fresh cider. The domestic simplicity of the scene, so ordinary yet so precious after the hardships of the past year, filled her with quiet gratitude. "Mama, look," Timothy's voice carried across the clearing. "Mr. Bryce is teaching us to fish." Catherine looked up to see Bryce demonstrating the proper technique for casting a line, his movements fluid and precise. The boys watched with rapt attention, their small faces intent with concentration. The sight: Bryce's patient instruction, her son's eager learning, created a tightness in Catherine's throat that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with hope. Later, as they ate their picnic, Samuel asked the question Catherine had been dreading. "Mr. Bryce, did you know our pa?" A momentary silence fell over the group. Bryce set down his biscuit, giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. "No, Samuel, I didn't have that honor," he said finally. "But your mother has told me about him, and I know he was a fine man who loved you boys very much." "He was the strongest man in our town," Timothy declared proudly. "Could bend horseshoes with his bare hands." "That's very impressive," Bryce agreed solemnly. "Blacksmithing takes great strength and skill." "Do you miss him too?" Peter asked, his small face serious. Bryce glanced at Catherine, seeking guidance, but she nodded slightly, trusting his instincts. "I miss what he meant to you and your mother," Bryce said carefully, "and I'm sorry I never got to know a man who raised such fine sons." The simple honesty of the response, neither claiming emotions not rightfully his nor diminishing Patrick's importance, brought tears to Catherine's eyes. Bryce was acknowledging her husband's place in their family's story while gently establishing his own distinctive role. "Mama says Pa watches over us from heaven," Samuel offered, seemingly satisfied with Bryce's answer. "I believe he does," Bryce affirmed, "and I think he'd be very proud of how brave and strong you've all been." The conversation moved to lighter topics: plans for winter, hopes for Christmas, Timothy's growing skill with horses. But the moment lingered in Catherine's awareness. Bryce had navigated a potential minefield with grace and empathy, honoring Patrick's memory while building his own connection with her sons. As they packed up the picnic later, the boys running ahead toward the wagon, Bryce caught Catherine's hand. "Did I handle that all right?" he asked quietly. "About Patrick." The uncertainty in his voice, this confident man suddenly vulnerable, touched Catherine deeply. "Perfectly," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "You honored him while being true to yourself. I couldn't have asked for more." Relief softened Bryce's features. "They're wonderful boys, Catherine, smart and kind and curious." You've done an amazing job with them, especially given everything you've been through. They're resilient, Katherine said, watching her sons scramble into the wagon with exuberant energy. More than I sometimes give them credit for. And she hesitated, then continued with careful honesty, they've grown very attached to you. Bryce's expression grew serious. And I to them, he said simply, more than I expected. More than I thought possible, really. The admission hung between them, laden with implication. Katherine knew what Bryce wasn't saying, that his feelings for her sons had become entwined with his feelings for her, creating something deeper than mere romantic attraction. Something that looked remarkably like family. We should get back before dark, she said, not ready yet to put words to the emotions swirling between them. The boys will be exhausted after all this excitement. Bryce nodded, accepting her deflection without comment. But as they walked toward the wagon, he kept her hand in his, a silent affirmation of connection that required no words. The journey back to the ranch passed in comfortable conversation and occasional bursts of song, the boys teaching Bryce a ridiculous ditty about a three-legged dog that had Katherine laughing despite its dubious lyrical merits. By the time they arrived home, the sun was setting behind the mountains in a spectacular display of crimson and gold, and Peter had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder. Mrs. Harper greeted them with her customary mixture of fussing and affection, whisking the boys off for washing before dinner, while casting knowing glances between Katherine and Bryce that made Katherine's cheeks warm. She's not subtle, is she? Bryce observed with amusement as the housekeeper disappeared into the house, Samuel and Timothy in tow, Peter still slumbering in her capable arms. About as subtle as a stampeding buffalo, Katherine agreed, smiling despite her embarrassment, though her heart's in the right place. She cares about you, Bryce said, helping Katherine gather the remains of their picnic from the wagon. We all do. The simple statement, offered without expectation or pressure, crystallized something in Katherine's heart, a certainty that had been growing steadily since those first days at the ranch. The rocking tea had become more than refuge or employment. It had become home in the deepest sense, a place of belonging, of connection, of possibility. And Bryce Ingram had become essential to that sense of home in ways Katherine could no longer deny, even to herself. As they crossed the yard toward the house, the day's golden light fading to purple dusk, Katherine made a decision. The time for caution, for holding her heart in reserve, had passed. Patrick would always be part of her sons, their first father, her first love. But life continued, and love, it seemed, could grow anew even from the ashes of grief. Bryce, she said softly, pausing before they reached the porch, today was perfect, thank you. He turned to her, his face partially shadowed in the gathering twilight, but his eyes, those summer-sky eyes that had first struck her on the trail 7 months ago, remained clear and warm. It was my pleasure, he said simply. Seeing you happy, the boys laughing, it's all I could ask for. The selflessness of the statement, the genuine joy he took in her family's happiness, confirmed what Katherine already knew. With deliberate intent, she stepped closer, her hand finding his cheek in a gesture of tenderness that needed no explanation. Katherine, her name was a question on his lips, hope and uncertainty mingled in equal measure. In answer, she kissed him, not the careful, tentative kisses they had shared before, but something deeper, an offering and a promise combined. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, his response equal parts restraint and passion. When they parted, breath mingling in the cool evening air, Katherine found the courage to speak the truth that had been growing in her heart. I'm falling in love with you, Bryce Ingram, she whispered. I didn't expect it. Didn't think it possible so soon after everything, but there it is. Joy transformed Bryce's face, followed immediately by concern. Katherine, are you sure? It's barely been 8 months since. She placed a finger gently against his lips. I'm sure, she said firmly. Patrick will always be part of me, part of our family, but my heart seems to have room I didn't know existed. She smiled slightly. And you, with your patience and kindness, have filled that space without my even noticing until it was already done. Bryce captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm with fervent emotion. "I've loved you since the day you arrived," he admitted, his voice rough with feeling. "You and your boys, the family I never thought I'd have." The word family hung between them, precious and fragile and full of possibility. "We should go in," Katherine said finally, though she made no move to withdraw from his embrace. "They'll be waiting dinner for us." Bryce nodded, reluctantly releasing her, though he kept her hand firmly in his. "Katherine," he said, his expression growing serious, "I want you to know that I understand your boys come first, always, and I would never try to replace their father in their memories or their hearts." The promise, so exactly what Katherine needed to hear, though she hadn't known it until that moment, confirmed the rightness of her feelings. "I know," she said simply. "That's one of the reasons I love you." The admission, freely given now, brought such joy to Bryce's face that Katherine felt her own heart expand with answering happiness. Whatever came next, however their relationship evolved, she knew with sudden clarity that she had found not just refuge but home, not just security but love. Hand in hand they walked toward the house, where light spilled from windows in golden welcome, and the sounds of her sons' voices mingled with Mrs. Harper's affectionate scolding. Behind them, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, solid and enduring as the love taking root between them. November brought the first serious snowfall, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white that delighted the boys and increased everyone's workload. Livestock needed extra care in the cold, paths required constant clearing, and the house demanded additional attention to maintain warmth and comfort against winter's assault. Katherine found unexpected pleasure in the season's challenges. There was satisfaction in preserving her family's well-being against the elements, in the wood stove's steady heat, in wool stockings dried before the fire, in hearty stews that fortified against the cold. The ranch's isolation, which might have felt threatening in summer, now created a cocoon of intimacy that strengthened bonds among its inhabitants. Her relationship with Bryce deepened with the same quiet steadiness that characterized everything about him. Their feelings, once acknowledged, blossomed without artifice or game playing. Morning coffee shared in the kitchen before the ranch awakened. Evening conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to deeper philosophical questions. His hand finding hers beneath the table during meals. Small gestures of affection, observed by everyone yet commented on by no one. Edward Thornton, returned from another brief business trip to Denver, watched their growing attachment with obvious approval. "Never seen the boy so content," he confided to Katherine one afternoon as they reviewed household accounts. "You've been good for him, Mrs. O'Malley." "He's been good for us as well," Katherine replied, a smile warming her voice. "The boys adore him." Thornton's expression grew thoughtful. "And you, my dear, how do you feel about my foreman?" The direct question, though not unexpected from a man of Thornton's forthright nature, still brought heat to Katherine's cheeks. "I care for him deeply," she answered honestly, "more than I thought possible when we arrived here." Satisfaction gleamed in Thornton's eyes. "Good," he said simply, "very good." 2 weeks before Christmas, the weather cleared enough for a trip to Pine Creek. The town had transformed for the holidays, with evergreen boughs and red ribbons adorning storefronts and a general atmosphere of festivity despite the frigid temperatures. "We'll split up," Bryce suggested as he helped Katherine and the boys from the wagon. "I have some business at the bank and supplies to collect. You can do your shopping, and we'll meet at the hotel for lunch at noon." Katherine nodded, grateful for the opportunity to purchase Christmas gifts without Bryce's observation. The small sum she had saved from her wages would provide modest presents for her sons and the ranch household, including something special for Bryce himself, though what that might be, she had yet to determine. As she guided the boys through Pine Creek's main street, Katherine marveled at how different her perspective was from her first visit months ago. Then, the town had represented last hope and bitter disappointment. Now it was simply a pleasant place to conduct business, with the security of home waiting at the rocking tee. The general store yielded treasures within Katherine's budget: a penknife for Timothy, a set of colored pencils for Samuel, a toy wooden horse for Peter. For Mrs. Harper she selected a fine bone comb, for Thomas a new pipe. For the younger hands, knitted scarves commissioned from the storekeeper's wife weeks earlier. For Bryce, however, nothing seemed quite right. Katherine wanted something personal yet practical, something that would convey her feelings without embarrassing his masculine sensibilities. "May I help you find something specific, Mrs. O'Malley?" the storekeeper inquired as Katherine hesitated before a display of men's accessories. "I'm looking for a gift," Katherine explained. For a special friend." Understanding lit the merchant's eyes. News of Katherine's situation at the Rocking Tea had clearly reached town gossip networks. "Perhaps a timepiece," he suggested tactfully. "We've received a new shipment from Denver." The pocket watches he displayed were handsome but beyond Katherine's means. She was about to decline when a different item caught her eye, a silver-framed daguerreotype case, simple yet elegant, with room for 2 small images. "This," she decided immediately, "this is perfect." The storekeeper named a price that, while steep, remained within her carefully budgeted funds. As he wrapped the purchase, Katherine felt a surge of anticipation. The gift was empty now, but she had an idea that would make it deeply meaningful. By the time Katherine and the boys reached the hotel for lunch, they were laden with packages and exhilarated by their expedition. Bryce waited in the dining room, his own shopping apparently completed and stored elsewhere. "Successful morning?" he inquired, helping Peter onto a chair while the older boys arranged themselves with unusual decorum. "Very," Katherine confirmed, smiling at her son's barely contained excitement. Christmas had been a subdued affair last year, coming so soon after Patrick's death. This year promised joy she had thought permanently lost. Lunch passed pleasantly, the boys on their best behavior due to both the public setting and Bryce's gentle but firm expectations. As they prepared to depart, a snowfall began, gentle at first, then thickening rapidly. "We should head back," Bryce decided, frowning at the darkening sky. "This looks like it could develop into something serious." They had traveled barely half the distance to the ranch when the storm intensified dramatically. Wind drove snow horizontally across the road, visibility reduced to mere yards, and the temperature plummeted with alarming speed. "Blizzard," Bryce shouted above the wind's howl. "We need shelter." Katherine clutched Peter to her chest, while Timothy and Samuel huddled together beneath the wagon's canvas covering. Fear clawed at her throat, not for herself, but for her sons exposed to the killing cold of a Colorado winter storm. Bryce guided the horses with expert precision despite the near-whiteout conditions. "There's a line shack about a quarter-mile ahead," he called back to Katherine, "used by the hands during spring roundup. Basic but solid." The small cabin materialized like a miracle in the swirling whiteness, a dark shape against the uniform blank of snow. Bryce pulled the wagon as close as possible to the door, then turned to Katherine. "I'll get the boys inside first," he shouted above the wind, "then come back for you and our supplies." Katherine nodded, unwilling to release Peter even momentarily. "Take Samuel first," she instructed. "He's smallest after Peter." Bryce wrapped Samuel in his own heavy coat, then lifted the boy into his arms and plunged into the blizzard. He returned moments later for Timothy, who insisted bravely that he could walk on his own, a claim Bryce sensibly ignored, carrying him just as he had Samuel. When Bryce returned for Katherine and Peter, his face was already reddened by cold, ice forming in his eyebrows and mustache. "Almost there," he encouraged, helping her down from the wagon with one arm while retrieving essential supplies with the other. The line shack's interior was cold and dark, but blessedly free from the wind's murderous assault. A small iron stove occupied one corner, a narrow bunk the other. No luxuries, not even basic comforts beyond shelter, but in that moment it seemed a palace to Katherine. Bryce moved with efficient urgency, retrieving more supplies from the wagon before the storm could claim it completely, then turning his attention to the stove. A small woodpile beside it provided fuel, and within minutes he had kindled a fire that promised eventual warmth. "The horses?" Katherine asked as she helped the boys remove snow-crusted outer garments. "Unhitched and in the lean-to around back," Bryce assured her. "Not comfortable, but they'll survive." As the cabin gradually warmed, their situation became clearer. The storm showed no signs of abating, darkness was falling rapidly, and they had limited supplies, some food from their picnic lunch, water in canteens, blankets from the wagon, and whatever meager provisions might be stored in the cabin. "We'll need to spend the night," Bryce said, confirming what Katherine had already concluded. "The storm's too dangerous for travel, especially in darkness." Katherine nodded, pushing aside concerns about propriety in favor of practical survival. "The boys can take the bunk," she decided. "We'll manage with blankets near the stove." Once immediate needs were addressed, warming cold fingers and toes, distributing food and water, arranging sleeping accommodations, an awkward awareness settled over the adults. They had never spent a night under the same roof without the buffer of others, and despite the emergency nature of their situation, conventional standards of behavior still exerted their influence. Bryce seemed acutely conscious of the impropriety, maintaining a careful physical distance from Katherine except when passing supplies or assisting with the boys. His restraint, while admirable, added attention to the small space that seemed at odds with the intimacy they had been developing. As darkness enveloped the cabin with only firelight providing illumination, Bryce made a final check of their situation. "Storm's still raging," he reported, returning from a brief foray to the door, "but we're secure here. Plenty of wood for the night, and I found some emergency supplies in the storage chest, coffee, jerky, even a can of peaches." "A feast," Katherine said with a smile, trying to maintain optimism for the boys' sake. Timothy and Samuel had already fallen asleep on the narrow bunk, exhausted by the day's excitement and terror. Peter remained awake, curled in Katherine's lap near the stove, his small face solemn in the firelight. "Are we lost, Mama?" he asked suddenly. Katherine stroked his hair reassuringly. "No, sweetheart, we're just waiting for the storm to pass, then Mr. Bryce will take us home." Peter considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "Is Mr. Bryce going to be our new papa?" The innocent question, delivered with a child's directness, created an instant stillness in the cabin. Katherine felt heat rush to her face, while Bryce, kneeling by the stove to add another log, froze in position. "Peter," Katherine began carefully, "Mr. Bryce is a very special friend to us, but—" "Because Tommy Jackson got a new papa when his first papa died," Peter continued with implacable 4-year-old logic. "And I think Mr. Bryce would be a good papa. He teaches us things and makes you smile." Katherine glanced helplessly at Bryce, who had risen to his feet, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Those are big questions for a little boy," Bryce said finally, his voice gentle as he approached and crouched to Peter's eye level. "But I can tell you this, I care very much about you and your brothers and your mother, and I will always try to keep you safe and happy, just like I'm doing tonight." Peter seemed to consider this answer, weighing its adequacy against his question. "But do you love us?" he persisted. "Tommy's new papa loves them, that's what makes him a real papa." The directness of the question, so innocent yet so profound, created a lump in Katherine's throat. She looked at Bryce, seeing the emotion that crossed his face, the careful consideration he gave to Peter's question. "Yes, Peter," Bryce said finally, his voice rough with feeling. "I do love you, all of you. Very much." Peter nodded, satisfied at last. "That's good," he declared, snuggling deeper into Katherine's embrace. "I love you too." With that simple resolution, Peter's eyes began to drift closed, the day's excitement finally claiming him. Within moments, his breathing had deepened into sleep, leaving the adults in a silence vibrating with unspoken emotion. "I'm sorry," Katherine whispered once she was certain Peter slumbered. "Children have no filter." Bryce moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, providing warmth both physical and emotional. "Don't apologize," he said quietly. "He asked an honest question. He deserved an honest answer." Katherine studied Bryce's profile in the firelight, the strong jaw, the straight nose, the eyes that reflected flames in their depths. "Did you mean it?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the storm's howl and the fire's crackle. Bryce turned to meet her gaze directly. "Every word," he said simply. "I love them, Katherine, and I love you, more than I thought possible." The declaration, so straightforward, so free from artifice or calculation, reached something deep in Catherine's heart. In that moment, in a crude-lined shack with a blizzard raging outside and her children sleeping nearby, Catherine recognized the gift being offered. Not just love, but family restored. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming easier than expected, as natural as breath. "So much that it frightens me sometimes." Bryce's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "What frightens you?" he asked gently. Catherine leaned into his strength, Peter's sleeping form cradled between them. "Losing again," she admitted. "Opening my heart only to have it broken. The boys becoming attached only to suffer another loss." Bryce's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I can't promise nothing will ever happen to me," he said honestly. "No one can make that promise, but I can promise that as long as I have breath in my body, I will love you and these boys with everything I am." The sincerity in his voice, the steady pressure of his hand on hers, the warmth of his body against the cold that surrounded them, all combined to create a certainty in Catherine's heart. This man, this moment, this love, it was real and true and worth whatever risk it entailed. "When I lost Patrick," she said slowly, finding words for feelings long suppressed, "I thought that part of my life was over. That love was something I'd had once and lost and would never find again." She looked down at Peter's sleeping face, then at Bryce. "I was wrong. Love found me again, even when I wasn't looking for it." Bryce's free hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. "Catherine," he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. "Will you marry me? Become my wife, let me be a father to your sons, build a life together at the rocking tee." The proposal, direct and heartfelt, without elaborate preparation or dramatic gesture, was perfect in its sincerity. Tears sprang to Catherine's eyes, not of sorrow but of joy so intense it bordered on pain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Bryce Ingram." His kiss was gentle, mindful of the sleeping child between them, yet filled with promise and passion and certainty. When they parted, Bryce rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool air. "When the snow clears," he said softly, "we'll tell everyone, do things properly." Catherine nodded, a smile curving her lips. "The boys will be ecstatic," she predicted, "especially Peter, who apparently has been considering the matter for some time." Bryce chuckled, the sound warming Catherine more effectively than the stove. "Wise beyond his years," he agreed. "Recognized what I've known since that first day, that you and your sons are the family I've been waiting for my whole life." They remained that way through the long night, Catherine eventually drifting to sleep against Bryce's shoulder, Peter cradled between them, while Bryce maintained watch, rising occasionally to feed the fire that kept deadly cold at bay. Outside, the blizzard raged, a force of nature that might have claimed their lives. Inside, a different force had claimed their hearts, equally powerful but life-giving rather than destructive. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white broken only by the stark shapes of trees and distant mountains. Bryce opened the cabin door to blinding brightness and knife-edge cold that stole breath from lungs. "Beautiful," Catherine murmured, joining him at the threshold, Peter still sleeping in her arms. "Dangerous but beautiful." Bryce's arm encircled her waist, drawing her against him as they surveyed the glittering expanse. "Like love," he observed with unexpected poetry. "Worth the risk, though." Catherine looked up at him, this man who had emerged from tragedy to build a life of purpose and honor, who now offered to share that life with her and her sons. "Yes," she agreed softly, "worth everything." The journey back to the rocking tee proved challenging but manageable in daylight. The boys, excited by adventure rather than frightened by danger, chattered constantly, recounting their experience with dramatic embellishments that made Catherine smile despite her lingering concerns about their exposure to the elements. As they approached the ranch, evidence of anxiety about their absence became apparent. Riders were visible in several directions, clearly searching, and smoke poured from the main house chimney in volumes that suggested a welcome being prepared. "They're back," the shout came from young Caleb, who had been posted as lookout and now raced toward the house, waving his arms excitedly. "They made it." By the time Bryce guided the wagon into the yard, the entire ranch had emerged to greet them. Mrs. Harper wiping tears with her apron, Thomas looking uncharacteristically emotional, the ranch hands grinning with relief, and Edward Thornton striding forward with authority. "Thank God," Thornton declared, helping Katherine from the wagon with careful hands. "We were about to organize a full search party. Another hour and we'd have been out in force." "The storm caught us halfway home," Bryce explained as he lifted the boys down. "We took shelter in the North Line shack until morning." Understanding dawned in Thornton's eyes, understanding that encompassed not just their physical circumstances, but the implications of a night spent in such close quarters. His gaze moved between Bryce and Katherine, noting perhaps the subtle shift in their demeanor, the way they gravitated toward each other even while attending to practical matters. Mrs. Harper took charge of the boys, whisking them toward the house with promises of hot chocolate and warm baths, leaving the adults for more serious discussion. "You'll want to clean up and rest," Thornton said to Katherine. "We can talk later." Katherine nodded gratefully, though she exchanged a meaningful glance with Bryce before following Mrs. Harper into the house. There would be announcements to make, plans to discuss, but for now, the simple comfort of home beckoned. Later that afternoon, freshly bathed and rested, Katherine found Bryce in the barn, meticulously checking the horses for any ill effects from their exposure to the storm. "They seem fine," he reported as she approached. "Tough animals used to Colorado winters." "Unlike delicate city-bred humans," Katherine said with a smile, remembering her early days on the frontier with chagrin. Bryce straightened, his expression growing serious. "You're not delicate, Katherine O'Malley. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known." The compliment warmed her more than she expected. "When should we tell everyone?" she asked, changing the subject before emotion overwhelmed her. "About our engagement." Bryce's face brightened at the word. "Tonight, at dinner, or we could wait until Christmas if you prefer." Katherine considered briefly. "Tonight," she decided. "I don't want to wait, and the boys deserve to know as soon as possible. Especially Peter, who's already appointed you his new father." Bryce laughed, the sound echoing in the barn's raftered height. "Smart boy," he said, reaching for Katherine's hand. "Best decision I've ever made, asking you to marry me, even if it took a blizzard to give me the courage." "You've never lacked courage, Bryce Ingram," Katherine corrected softly. "Just the right moment." Their kiss was different now, no longer tentative exploration but confident claim, a sealing of promises made and intentions declared. When they parted, breathless and flushed despite the barn's chill, Katherine felt a certainty that had been absent from her life since Patrick's death. Whatever the future held, she would face it with Bryce beside her, their strength combined for the benefit of the children who would become their family. Dinner that evening felt charged with anticipation, at least to Katherine. The boys, recovered from their adventure with the resilience of youth, chattered about Christmas plans and their heroic survival of the blizzard, while the ranch hands contributed tales of their own weather-related exploits over the years. Edward Thornton presided over the meal with his usual authoritative bonhomie, though Katherine caught him watching her and Bryce with speculative interest several times. Mrs. Harper, too, seemed unusually attentive, her shrewd eyes missing nothing of the glances that passed between them. As dessert apple pie with fresh cream was being served, Bryce cleared his throat, the sound instantly commanding attention from the assembled company. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice steady though Katherine could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Last night during the storm, I asked Mrs. O'Malley to do me the honor of becoming my wife." His gaze found Katherine, warmth radiating from his eyes. "And to my eternal gratitude, she has agreed." A moment of stunned silence was followed by an eruption of reaction. Mrs. Harper's delighted exclamation, Thomas's gruff, "Well, it's about time," the younger hand's whoops of congratulation, and Edward Thornton's satisfied smile that suggested the development was both expected and welcome. Timothy and Samuel appeared momentarily confused, looking to their mother for confirmation. Peter, however, reacted with immediate joy. "I knew it," he crowed, bouncing in his seat. "I knew Mr. Bryce was going to be our new papa. Katherine reached for her older son's hands across the table. "Boys," she said gently, "I hope you're happy about this. Mr. Bryce has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. He'll be your stepfather, though your real father will always be in our hearts." Timothy, at 7, the most aware of what this meant, studied Bryce with solemn intensity. "Will we still live at the ranch?" he asked finally. Bryce nodded, addressing the boy with the respect he deserved. "Yes, Timothy, the rocking tee will be our home, and one day, if you choose, you could learn to run it alongside me." The prospect of such a future, concrete, masculine, filled with horses and cattle and important responsibilities, clearly appealed to Timothy, who had shouldered the role of man of the family since Patrick's death. He nodded, decision made. "That would be good," he declared. "Pa would like that." Samuel, less concerned with practical matters, had a different priority. "Will you read to us at bedtime?" he asked Bryce. "Mama does voices, but she doesn't know the cowboy stories like you do." Bryce's face softened with affection. "Every night I'm not working late," he promised, "and I'll teach you to read them yourself too." With the boy's approval secured, congratulations flowed freely. Edward Thornton rose, raising his water glass in a toast. "To Bryce and Katherine," he proclaimed, "may your years together be blessed with health, prosperity, and joy." The sentiment was echoed around the table, creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth, and everything to do with community and acceptance and shared happiness. Later, when the boys had been put to bed with extra stories to commemorate the occasion, Bryce and Katherine found themselves on the porch despite the cold, drawn by the need for a moment of privacy amidst the communal celebration. "Happy?" Bryce asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Katherine nodded, leaning against him as they gazed at stars brilliant against the velvet blackness of the Colorado night. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she admitted. "And a little frightened still." Bryce's arm tightened around her. "Of what?" Katherine considered, trying to articulate the shadow that still occasionally touched her joy. "Of tempting fate, perhaps, of being too happy, too fortunate when I've already had one life destroyed." She looked up at him, vulnerability in her eyes. "I couldn't bear to lose you too, Bryce. Not now, not after finding you against all odds." Bryce turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with gentle strength. "Katherine," he said softly, "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together, and that every day we have, whether it's 50 years or 50 days, will be lived with purpose and love." The wisdom in his words, the acknowledgement of life's uncertainty, coupled with the commitment to embracing its gifts regardless, soothed Katherine's lingering fears. Bryce understood, as few would, the cost of loss and the courage required to risk love again. "When should we marry?" she asked, practical considerations returning now that the decision was made. "As soon as possible," Bryce replied immediately, then paused. "Unless you want to wait for propriety's sake." Katherine smiled, touched by his concern for her reputation, even as she recognized its irrelevance in their frontier circumstances. "Spring," she decided. "When the snow melts and flowers return, it seems right, somehow, a new beginning as the world renews itself." Bryce nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "Spring it is. Though it's going to be a very long winter waiting." The hint of desire in his voice, the way his gaze lingered on her lips, sent warmth coursing through Katherine despite the cold. "We have much to plan," she reminded him, her own voice betraying similar feelings. "And the boys will need time to adjust to the idea." "Of course," Bryce agreed, though his hands remained at her waist, keeping her close. "We'll do everything properly, set a good example." The propriety of their current position, alone on a moonlit porch, bodies pressed together for warmth that had little to do with temperature, might have been questionable by strict social standards. But as Bryce's lips found hers in a kiss that promised future intimacies, Katherine found she cared less about convention and more about the love that had found her when she least expected it. "We should go in," she murmured when they finally parted, "before we scandalize the entire ranch." Bryce laughed softly, pressing his forehead against hers. Too late for that, I think, Mrs. Harper's probably watching from the window right now. Katherine glanced toward the house, where indeed a curtain seemed to twitch suspiciously. Let her watch, she said with uncharacteristic boldness. I'm a grown woman engaged to be married. I'm entitled to kiss my fiancée if I wish. I like this rebellious side of you, Katherine O'Malley, Bryce teased, stealing another quick kiss before offering his arm with exaggerated formality. Shall we return to civilization, my lady, before you lead me further into temptation? Katherine took his arm, laughing as they made their way toward the warmth and light of the house. Behind them, the vast Colorado night spread in star-spangled majesty. Ahead, the golden glow of home and family beckoned. Between past and future, they walked together, finding in each other the courage to embrace whatever lay ahead. Christmas at the rocking tee surpassed all expectations. Edward Thornton, determined that his foreman's engagement and the boys' first holiday at the ranch be memorable, orchestrated festivities on a scale that left even Mrs. Harper impressed. A massive pine tree was harvested from the North Ridge and installed in the main room, its branches adorned with paper stars crafted by the boys, strings of cranberries and popcorn, and small carved wooden ornaments that Thomas produced from some hidden repository of talent. Evergreen boughs decorated mantels and doorways, filling the house with the scent of forest and renewal. Gifts appeared as if by magic, practical items for the ranch hands, but for the boys, treasures beyond their wildest dreams. Timothy received his first real saddle, sized for a growing boy. Samuel found art supplies of quality his mother could never have afforded. Peter unwrapped a handcrafted rocking horse that brought tears to Katherine's eyes with its perfect detail, down to the real horsehair mane and tail that Thomas had undoubtedly sourced from the stables. It was a labor of love that spoke volumes about the old foreman's affection for the youngest O'Malley, despite his gruff exterior. "It's beautiful," Katherine whispered, watching Peter climb onto the wooden steed with a shout of triumph. "Thomas spent 3 months on it," Bryce revealed quietly, slipping his arm around her waist. "Carved it in the evenings when he thought no one was watching." Katherine looked around the room, at Thomas pretending to be grumpy while showing Samuel a carving technique, at Edward Thornton laughing as Timothy demonstrated his new saddle on the arm of the sofa, at Mrs. Harper bustling about with trays of sweets, beaming like a grandmother. They have a family, she realized aloud, the magnitude of it hitting her fully for the first time. Not just us. They have a whole family. We all do, Bryce corrected, pulling her closer. That's what the rocking tee is, broken pieces fitting together to make something whole. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small, rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. "I believe there's one more." Katherine took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She unwrapped the paper to reveal the silver daguerreotype case she had purchased in town. She gasped, looking up at him. "But this is what I got for you." Bryce smiled, his eyes dancing. "I know, Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile told me. He said you'd picked out the finest case in the shipment. So you bought the same one. Open it." She pressed the small latch. Inside, on the left, was a tintype of her 3 sons, clearly taken recently, likely during one of their lessons with Thomas when she had been occupied elsewhere. They looked solemn and scrubbed, hair plastered down, eyes bright. On the right was a picture of the ranch house with the mountains rising behind it. "I wanted you to carry your home with you," Bryce said softly, "so you'd never doubt where you belonged." Tears spilled over Katherine's cheeks. She reached into her own pocket and pulled out the identical wrapped package. I didn't have a chance to put a picture in yours yet," she admitted, laughing through her tears. "I was going to ask Mr. Henderson to take one of us, all of us, after the wedding." "Then we'll wait," Bryce said, taking her gift and placing it on the mantel next to the clock. "We have a lifetime to fill it." He turned her in his arms, ignoring the room full of people to kiss her soundly. The cheers from the boys and the applause from the ranch hands washed over them, a chorus of approval that sealed their future. The wedding took place in May, when the wildflowers turned the valley into a quilt of purple and gold. It was held on the porch of the ranch house, with the mountains as their cathedral and the open sky as their roof. Katherine wore a dress of pale blue silk, a gift from Edward Thornton, who insisted that the bride of his foreman and the mother of his grandsons, as he had begun to call the boys, should look like a queen. Timothy stood as Bryce's best man, looking fiercely proud in a miniature suit. Samuel and Peter served as ring-bearers, though Peter got distracted halfway down the aisle by a particularly interesting beetle, requiring Samuel to herd him the rest of the way. When the minister asked for the rings, Bryce's hand was steady as he slid the gold band onto Katherine's finger. But when he spoke his vows, his voice was thick with emotion. "I, Bryce, take you, Katherine, and Timothy and Samuel and Peter, to be my family, to love and to protect from this day forward." Katherine's answer was a whisper that carried on the spring breeze. "I, Katherine, take you, Bryce, to be my home." The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was dancing in the barn, food enough to feed an army, and a sense of joy so palpable it seemed to shimmer in the air. As the stars came out, Bryce found Katherine standing at the edge of the yard, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains. "Regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Only that Patrick isn't here to see them so happy," she said honestly, "but I think he knows." "He knows they're loved," Bryce promised, "and he knows you are." Katherine turned in his arms. "I never thought I'd find this," she whispered. "I was so sure my life was over." "It was just waiting for the right turn in the road," Bryce said, "for a broken wagon wheel. And a cowboy who wouldn't leave strangers in the dark." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of wedding cake and promise. "Come inside, Mrs. Ingram," he murmured against her lips. "It's getting cold." "I'm not cold," Katherine said, leaning her head against his chest and listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "I don't think I'll ever be cold again." 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the rocking tee, but the shade of the porch offered a cool retreat. Katherine sat in the rocking chair, a sleeping infant in her arms, a girl this time, with Bryce's dark hair and Katherine's nose. In the yard, 12-year-old Timothy was teaching 8-year-old Peter to rope a fence post, while 10-year-old Samuel sat on the steps, sketching the scene in a notebook. A rider approached from the pasture, Bryce, looking older, broader, but with the same easy grace in the saddle. He dismounted and tied his horse, walking toward the house with the long, purposeful stride of a man coming home. "Pa!" Peter shouted, abandoning his roping lesson to run to him. Bryce caught the boy, swinging him up before setting him down to ruffle Samuel's hair and nod approvingly at Timothy's technique. He walked up the steps, removing his hat as he approached Katherine. He looked down at his wife and his daughter, his expression softening into that look of profound, quiet love that still made Katherine's breath catch. "She's sleeping," he whispered. "For now," Katherine smiled. "She has her father's energy." "And her mother's stubbornness," Bryce countered, leaning down to kiss Katherine. Edward Thornton came out of the house, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He moved slower now, leaning on a cane, but his eyes were bright as he looked at the family gathered on his porch. "Good day," he asked Bryce. "Good day," Bryce confirmed, taking the lemonade. "Herd looks strong. And the boys did a fine job with the south fencing." Katherine watched them, her husband, her sons, the man who had become their grandfather, the baby sleeping in her arms. She thought of the terrified widow who had driven a broken wagon into this valley 5 years ago, believing she had nothing left to live for but duty. She looked at the mountains, unchanged and eternal. "You were right," she said softly to Bryce. "About what?" "About being home." Bryce sat on the railing near her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his touch an anchor in a world that kept turning. "I usually am," he teased gently. Katherine laughed, the sound mingling with the wind in the pines and the voices of her sons. The wagon had broken, yes, but it had broken in exactly the right place. "Yes," she agreed, closing her eyes and letting the peace of the afternoon wash over her. "You are."